The evening in downtown Los Angeles was like any other. Bustling streets, neon lights flickering above, and a constant hum of conversation and traffic. The city's energy was intoxicating, a mix of opportunity and chaos. At a high-end restaurant near the heart of the city, Elon Musk exited his sleek black Tesla, his mind preoccupied with an endless list of meetings and the pressures of his companies. But for once, the world around him seemed to fade as he walked toward the door of the restaurant. He wasn't expecting to encounter anything out of the ordinary. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? But then, a voice cut through the noise, startling him. "Hey, can you have dinner with me?" Elon stopped in his tracks. A man, roughly in his 50s, with ragged clothes and a scruffy beard, stood in front of him, eyes wide with a kind of vulnerability that caught Elon off guard. The man wasn't asking for money, wasn't shouting about his plight. He was simply asking for dinner. The contrast between them couldn't have been starker. Here was Elon Musk, a billionaire, the mind behind SpaceX and Tesla, about to walk into a lavish restaurant, while this man, whose clothes and demeanor screamed of a life on the streets, was making a simple request, one that didn't fit the usual narrative of desperation. Elon glanced around, almost expecting a hidden camera or a prank show crew to jump out from behind the corner. But there was no camera, no crew, just a man standing there, patiently waiting for an answer. "Dinner with you?" Elon repeated, still unsure if he heard the man right. "Yeah," the man said, his voice steady. "I just thought, maybe you'd like to eat with me." For a moment, Elon's mind raced. Was this a joke? Was the man trying to embarrass him in front of the public? But the look in the man's eyes was serious, earnest, even. The words hung between them in a way that felt strangely important. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Elon felt an unexpected pang in his chest, a fleeting moment of connection, like something deep inside him recognized a kindred spirit in this man, even if their worlds were oceans apart. He let out a breath, steeling himself. What was the worst that could happen? A conversation? An evening spent with someone who had nothing to lose? "All right," Elon said, shaking his head with a faint smile, a little amused by the absurdity of the situation. "Sure, let's have dinner." The man's eyes brightened with gratitude, and without another word, he led Elon to a nearby restaurant, a small, local spot that was far from the glitzy, world-renowned places Elon usually frequented. The simplicity of the place only added to the oddness of the moment. The other diners glanced up in shock as Elon Musk, the billionaire founder of SpaceX, took a seat across from the homeless man who had just asked him to dinner. It was the start of an encounter that no one, not even Elon himself, could have predicted. This moment would not just change the lives of two men. It would spark a chain of events that none of them could foresee. But for now, as they sat in the dimly lit restaurant, there was just the quiet sound of silverware clinking against plates and the faint hum of quiet conversation around them. In this little corner of the world, it was just the two of them, a billionaire and a homeless man, about to share a meal and maybe, just maybe, change the course of their lives forever. The warmth of the restaurant enveloped them as Elon settled into the worn leather booth. He glanced around, still somewhat disoriented by the unusual situation. The last thing he had expected on his evening out was to be sitting with a homeless man, let alone having dinner. The other diners were giving them curious glances, but Elon barely noticed. His mind was focused on the man across from him. The homeless man, whose name was John, fidgeted nervously with the edges of his tattered jacket. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, and the opulence of the restaurant seemed out of place for him. But despite the discomfort, there was a quiet resolve in his eyes. He wasn't here by accident. As the waitress approached, John ordered simply, a bowl of soup, some bread, and a cup of coffee. Elon, on the other hand, ordered the most expensive entree on the menu, his mind still trying to process what was happening. Neither of them spoke as the waitress left, and for a moment, there was a strange silence between them. Finally, John broke the ice. "I know this might seem weird, Asking you to dinner like that, John began, his voice low, almost apologetic. But I've been thinking a lot about life, about how things go wrong, you know? Elon nodded, feeling an unexpected connection. Something about John's words resonated with him. Maybe it was the simplicity, the rawness of it, or maybe it was the reminder that, no matter how successful you became, life could still feel like it was spiraling out of control. John looked down at his hands, his fingers calloused and stained from years of laboring, and the signs of life on the streets. I wasn't always like this, he continued, his voice trailing off as he chose his words carefully. I used to have everything. A house, a family, a career. I worked in tech, sort of like you, actually. Elon raised an eyebrow, genuinely curious. You worked in tech? Yeah, John said with a small, rueful smile. I was a software engineer for a few years. Then, I got into investments. Big mistakes. Really big ones. I lost everything. My job, my house, my wife, and then, my daughter. My family didn't want me around anymore. I made one bad choice after another, and eventually, I ended up here. He gestured vaguely to the worn-out clothes and the ragged shoes he wore, as if they were a metaphor for the life he had lived. Homeless. The words hung in the air, and Elon sat back, his mind swirling with the implications of what John had just said. The man in front of him had been where Elon had been, or at least where Elon might have been, if things had gone a little differently. Success had a price, and sometimes, no matter how brilliant you were, no matter how much you had, it all could come crashing down. You've had a rough go of it, haven't you? Elon said after a pause, his voice gentle, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because something about John's honesty disarmed him, or maybe it was because he'd seen his own reflection in John's story, how success could turn into an isolating, empty pursuit. John nodded, his eyes momentarily distant. I've hit rock bottom. And it's funny, because for a long time, I thought money was the answer. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, or found the next big investment, everything would fall into place. But that's not how it works, is it? No, Elon agreed quietly. He had spent so many years focused on his goals, changing the world with technology, making humanity a multi-planetary species, that sometimes he had to remind himself of the simpler truths, the things that really mattered. They sat there for a few moments, the sound of silverware clinking in the background. Neither man spoke, but both were lost in their thoughts. You asked me to dinner, Elon finally said, his voice cutting through the silence. I've been thinking about that. Why me? John let out a short laugh. I guess it's because, well, you're someone who's done the impossible. You've built empires, changed the world. And you're a reminder to me that it's not too late to start over. Maybe you've figured something out that I haven't. His gaze softened. I don't know. I just thought, if anyone could understand the weight of all this, it would be you. Elon's brow furrowed. Was John seeking validation? A way to connect to something greater than himself? Or was he simply looking for a way to make sense of a life that had been turned upside down? For a brief moment, Elon wasn't sure how to respond. But then something shifted. A feeling, almost like an old memory, gnawed at him. He thought about the early days of Tesla, the risks, the pressure, the constant feeling of walking on a tightrope. Back then, people had counted him out. His ideas had been laughed at, dismissed. But there had always been something inside him that refused to quit. He had always believed that if he could hold on long enough, things would eventually work out. And here, in front of him, was a man who had hit rock bottom, who had once believed in something, and lost it all. Yet, somehow, John hadn't given up. Not entirely. Elon felt a strange pull. He could see something in John's eyes, a flicker of the same determination Elon himself had once had, back when he was just a kid in his garage, building rockets. So, Elon said, his voice steady but thoughtful, what do you want? What's next for you? John looked up, his gaze serious now. I don't know yet, but I know I can't do this alone. Maybe that's why I asked you to dinner. Maybe you're the one person who can help me figure it out. Elon studied him for a long moment. There was something raw, something real about John's plea. It wasn't a request for charity. It wasn't an ask for a handout. It was a call for partnership, a chance to start over, not in isolation, but together. Something in Elon stirred, and he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his tone steady but with an edge of curiosity. "Let's talk about what comes next. But I'm not offering charity. If you're serious about this, we'll work for it. Together." John's eyes lit up, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't in years: hope. The conversation drifted into new territories from there. As the night wore on, their words grew more serious. There was an unspoken understanding between them that this evening could mark the beginning of something extraordinary. Elon had offered more than just a meal. He had offered a chance, an opportunity for both of them to do something different, something bigger. Neither of them knew exactly where this would lead, but one thing was certain: neither of them would walk away unchanged. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts as the night continued. John, his mind racing with the implications of the unexpected dinner, could hardly believe what had just happened. Elon Musk, a man he once only knew through the headlines, tech mogul, innovator, billionaire, had just offered him a partnership. And not just a partnership in some vague, abstract sense. No, Elon had made it clear. If John was serious, this could be the beginning of something much bigger than either of them. As the evening wore on, Elon remained oddly quiet, lost in thought. He stared out of the window, watching the city lights twinkle, but his mind was far from the present. It was as if he was simultaneously in two worlds: the one around him, with its glitzy restaurants and bright lights, and another, a world of ideas, of futures yet to unfold. But what was really going on in Elon Musk's head? What did a man who seemed to have it all, who was changing the future of humanity, see in a man like John? Elon had always been an outsider, even as a child. Born in Pretoria, South Africa, he had always been consumed with a thirst for knowledge. The books in his home became his refuge, and the technology of the future was his obsession. While other kids played soccer, he buried himself in stories about the cosmos, artificial intelligence, and the vast unknown. By the time he was a teenager, Elon had already taught himself computer programming, and he began to build his first video games. As a young man, he'd moved to Canada for school and then, eventually, to the United States. He studied physics and economics at the University of Pennsylvania, always with an eye toward shaping the future. At the age of 24, Elon dropped out of Stanford University after just 2 days, knowing that he had to follow his own path. The world didn't need another academic. It needed change. But no one knew that back then. Back in the late 90s, Elon's ambition was just a whisper in the wind. His first two ventures, Zip2 and X.com, seemed like noble but risky endeavors. X.com, in particular, was his attempt to revolutionize the financial industry, but in the early days, it was often dismissed by the tech elite as overly ambitious, even ridiculous. People were skeptical of his ideas, his boldness. But Elon wasn't deterred. It wasn't until he sold PayPal for $1.5 billion in 2002 that the world truly began to take notice. And from there, things escalated quickly. He invested that money into companies that would become the foundations of his empire: Tesla, SpaceX, and SolarCity. Each of these ventures was a gamble, a belief that if he could make the right breakthroughs, humanity could reach new heights. But they were also deeply personal to him. SpaceX wasn't just about rockets. It was about the survival of the human race. Tesla wasn't just about cars. It was about shifting the planet away from fossil fuels. And SolarCity wasn't just about clean energy. It was about sustainable living. And yet, despite all of this success, Elon had always felt something missing. There were moments, isolated moments, when he'd glance at a beautiful sunset or hear his kids laugh, and he would feel it, the ache for something more than just business. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch, a question that kept him up at night. Was he happy? Was this all worth it? At 50, with billions of dollars and a seat at the table of the world's most powerful decision-makers, Elon Musk had everything people could want. But deep down, he knew something wasn't quite right. He had burned through relationships, had a broken marriage behind him, and found himself surrounded by people who praised him but never truly knew him. His public persona was larger than life, but in his quieter moments, Elon often felt profoundly alone. It wasn't that Elon didn't care about the people around him. He did. He had people in his life whom he loved and cared for deeply, but there was always a distance between him and everyone else. He had long stopped seeking approval from others, but that didn't mean he didn't sometimes long for real, genuine connection. And then, in the middle of all his success, there was John, a homeless man with no resources, no connections, no reputation, who had, in a few simple words, managed to pierce through Elon's carefully constructed armor. Why? Why had John asked him to dinner? Why had Elon agreed? It wasn't just the boldness of the request. It was the sincerity in John's eyes, the vulnerability in his voice. There was a rawness to the encounter, a humanity that Elon had missed in his own life. Maybe John had once believed in something big, too. Maybe that belief had driven him to the heights of success, just as Elon had once been driven by a singular vision. And then, like so many others, he'd fallen, lost everything, and now lived in a kind of purgatory between the past and the present. Elon wondered if that was what he was afraid of, losing everything, losing touch with the things that truly mattered as he reached for the stars. Was that what John was trying to tell him? A deep sigh escaped Elon's lips, and he rubbed his face. As the waitress cleared their empty plates, John's words kept echoing in his mind. He could see himself in John. He could see what might have happened had he not kept going, had he not kept pushing. Maybe this is what I need, Elon murmured to himself, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to John or just reflecting on his own life. John, sensing the weight of Elon's thoughts, spoke softly. I didn't want anything from you, Elon. I just thought, maybe if I reached out, I don't know, maybe it would remind me that it's not too late. Maybe you could help me get back to something. Not just the money, but something that makes it all worth it. Elon looked up at him, meeting his eyes. You're right, he said slowly. It's not about the money. It's about finding something that matters. He leaned back in his seat, looking out the window at the Los Angeles skyline, now bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. And maybe I've been so focused on changing the world that I've forgotten to ask myself what really matters to me. John smiled faintly, as if he had just heard something profound. Maybe, Elon continued, I could help you find that. But you're going to have to do the hard work. I can guide you, but this is going to be on you. Are you ready for that? John nodded, a sense of quiet determination in his eyes. I've been through rock bottom, Elon. I know what it means to start over, but I'm ready. It wasn't just the offer that mattered. It was the understanding between them. Elon was offering something far more valuable than a business opportunity. He was offering a chance for both of them to rediscover what truly mattered. Beyond success, beyond money, beyond the empire. The path forward wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be smooth. But it was a path they both seemed willing to take. And for the first time in years, Elon felt a flicker of hope, something deeper than any business venture. He looked back at John, a new sense of clarity in his eyes. Let's see where this goes, he said, his voice resolute. And just like that, the future of both men had been set on an unexpected course, one they would navigate together. The next few weeks flew by in a blur. Elon and John, two people from vastly different worlds, found themselves meeting regularly. It was strange at first. Elon, the CEO of some of the world's most groundbreaking companies, and John, a man who had fallen through the cracks of society, sitting together in quiet cafes and obscure corners of the city. They discussed everything from business to philosophy, from personal failures to grand ideas for the future. Elon had always been a big believer in the idea of first principles, breaking down problems to their core and building up from there. But now, in the presence of John, he was learning that first principles didn't just apply to technology, they could apply to life itself. John had proven to be more insightful than Elon had anticipated. In their early meetings, John wasn't just asking for help, he was offering ideas. He wasn't looking for handouts. Instead, he wanted to understand how to rebuild from the ground up. He wanted to find meaning, not in the material success he had once pursued, but in the fundamental truths of life. What's the point of success, really? John asked one evening as they sat in a small diner on the outskirts of LA. I had all the money I could spend, a career most people would envy. But what good is it if you're miserable? What's the point if you don't have anyone to share it with? Elon had never really considered this in such a direct way. Sure, he had his family, his children, but the demands of his companies often left him isolated, spending more time in boardrooms than with the people who mattered most. He had always believed that if he just pushed forward, if he just worked hard enough, everything else would fall into place. But now, sitting across from John, he wasn't so sure. "It's funny you say that," Elon replied, taking a sip from his coffee. "I often wonder the same thing. You reach for these lofty goals, going to Mars, revolutionizing electric cars, and then, at the end of the day, you're left alone. People admire you, but they don't really know you. And you start to wonder if it's worth it." John gave a small, knowing smile. "You know, I thought I was the only one who felt that way. It's like you're running a race, but you're not sure who you're running for, or why you're even running at all." "Exactly," Elon said, his eyes reflecting a sudden clarity. "And maybe that's why I'm sitting here with you right now. Because for the first time in a long time, I don't feel alone. I feel like you understand something I didn't know I was missing." John looked at him, his face softening. "Maybe that's the whole point, Elon. Maybe we're all looking for connection in places we don't even know to look. Maybe I've spent too much time looking at the wrong things, the money, the stuff, the cars, thinking they'd give me happiness. But I think I need to reconnect with people, with life, with myself." Elon was struck by the wisdom in John's words. It was the kind of insight that only came from experiencing real hardship, the kind of insight that made you step back and reassess everything you thought you knew. "I think you're right," Elon said, his voice almost a whisper. "Maybe I've been too focused on the future, so focused on achieving something extraordinary that I've forgotten to actually live in the present, to actually experience the things that make life worth living." John nodded. "Yeah, it's like you're on this treadmill, running as fast as you can, but you don't realize you're missing everything around you." Elon leaned back in his seat, deep in thought. He had spent his entire life chasing the next big thing, whether it was a new innovation, a new technology, or a new company. But now, in this moment, he realized that none of that would matter if he didn't take the time to reconnect with the human side of life, the side that John seemed to understand so well. As the weeks passed, their meetings continued, and a quiet friendship began to form between them. Elon, despite his initial hesitations, found himself more and more drawn to John's perspective on life. John wasn't a business guru. He wasn't a philosopher or a scientist. But he had lived through something that Elon could never fully understand: the depths of despair, the loneliness of losing everything, and the courage it took to start over. John, for his part, began to understand something else: the sheer willpower it took to create something as transformative as Tesla or SpaceX. Elon's mind worked in ways John could barely grasp, but it wasn't just about the technology. It was about a vision for the future, a belief in the impossible. And in that, John saw a reflection of his own struggle, a fight to rebuild, to find meaning after everything had crumbled. They both understood what it was like to fail and to get back up again. One evening, as they sat together in a small park near downtown, John broached a new subject. "I've been thinking," he began. "I don't want to just go back to where I was before. That was part of the problem, right? I had everything, but I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't have purpose. But now, I feel like I need to find something real to focus on. I want to help others, people like me, people who have lost everything and don't know how to get back up." Elon listened intently, his mind already racing with possibilities. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said. "When you hit rock bottom, it's hard to see a way out. It's easy to feel like you've failed, like there's no path forward, but there is always a way out. It's about giving people the tools to rebuild, just like you're doing with yourself." John's eyes brightened. "So, you think it's possible? You think we could really help people like me?" "I think it's more than possible," Elon said, his voice firm. "I think it's essential. If I can build rockets to take humans to Mars, I can certainly help people like you find their footing again. It's about giving people the resources and the opportunity to change." John smiled, a real, genuine smile. "I've got to admit, Elon, you're making me believe in something again. Maybe it's not about trying to get everything back. Maybe it's about using what I've got left to help others." Elon smiled back, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. Exactly. And we can do it. Together. And just like that, a new idea began to take shape. One that didn't revolve around money or status, but about real human connection and lifting each other up. For the first time in a long time, both men saw the path ahead of them clearly. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick, but it was going to be meaningful. They were about to embark on a journey that neither of them could have predicted, but both of them desperately needed. A journey that would change the course of their lives, and maybe even the lives of others. As the weeks went on, Elon and John began to make plans. The early stages were mostly about understanding each other's worlds. Elon, ever the visionary, was used to scaling up big ideas, turning bold concepts into billion-dollar enterprises. John, on the other hand, had experienced firsthand what it was like to have everything and then lose it all. He understood the emotional devastation of failure in a way that no amount of business strategy could replicate. Yet, despite their differences, they both shared a common goal: to make a difference. For Elon, this was nothing new. He had built companies that changed the world, after all. But this time, it was different. It wasn't about advancing technology for technology's sake. It wasn't about creating a product people didn't know they needed. This time, it was about rebuilding lives. It was about giving people who had fallen through the cracks a real chance at redemption. They started to focus their discussions on what exactly their mission would look like. The idea of helping the homeless, of giving people like John the tools to rebuild their lives, began to take shape. But this time, it wasn't about just giving charity. They both knew charity wasn't a long-term solution. They needed to think bigger. Elon leaned forward in his office one afternoon, staring at a whiteboard filled with diagrams and notes. What if we could create a system that gave people more than just a meal or a bed for the night? He asked, his voice full of intensity. What if we gave them the resources to rebuild their lives from the inside out? John, who had been sitting quietly across from him, nodded thoughtfully. He was starting to get a sense of what Elon was trying to say. You mean, not just giving them food or shelter, but actual training? Life skills? A way to get back into society? Exactly, Elon said, tapping the whiteboard with a marker. We need a comprehensive approach. Something that goes beyond temporary relief. We need to give people the skills, the education, and the mentorship to help them get back on their feet for good. And most importantly, we need to create an environment where they feel supported, not just as projects, but as people. John thought about this for a moment. It was clear to him that Elon wasn't interested in a quick fix or a feel-good publicity stunt. This was something bigger, something that could change lives in a real way. And for the first time in years, John felt a spark of hope. But how do we even start? John asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Elon smiled. We start with what we know. I've spent my entire career building systems that scale. Now we need to build a system of support that can scale, one that can reach the people who need it most. And we need to make sure it's something that works, something that lasts. It was clear that they both had a lot of work ahead of them. Elon could think big, but John knew firsthand what it was like to be at rock bottom. Together, they would need to figure out how to combine their skills to create something that could truly make a difference. The first step was finding a location to begin their pilot program. Elon knew they couldn't start with a huge operation. The key was to start small, test their ideas, and see what worked. But even in the early stages, the vision was clear. They would build a self-sustaining community for people who had been homeless or struggling with addiction, mental illness, or poverty. They would provide housing, education, job training, and most importantly, a sense of purpose. As Elon reached out to his network of contacts, he found that the idea resonated with a lot of people. Many of his colleagues in tech and philanthropy were eager to get involved. They didn't just want to donate money. They wanted to be part of something meaningful. I've been talking to a few people, Elon said one evening over dinner, as he and John sat together in the same diner where they had first met. Some of the biggest tech companies are interested in helping fund this project. And I've already spoken with some mental health professionals who are on board. We have the support we need. John's eyes widened. Wait, big tech companies are actually on board? I mean, that's incredible. How did you make that happen? Elon chuckled. It's not as hard as you think when you're working on something that could change the world. People like to be part of big ideas, especially when they can see the tangible impact. But John wasn't focused on the details. He was thinking about what it would mean for the people who would be part of this program. And what about the people who are actually going to be a part of this? The people who need this the most? How are we going to find them? Elon's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair. We can't just wait for them to come to us. We need to go out and find them. We need to connect with local shelters, organizations, and the community. The people who need help the most often don't have the resources to reach out themselves. It's our job to meet them where they are. John nodded. And we need to make sure they know this is more than just a temporary fix. We need to make them feel like they're worth it, like they matter. Elon smiled. Exactly. This is about giving people the opportunity to change, not because we're giving them charity, but because they're willing to put in the work. And we'll be there to support them every step of the way. As the weeks turned into months, Elon and John began to put their plans into action. They scouted locations for their first community. They recruited people with the right expertise, mental health professionals, life coaches, job trainers, and even former homeless individuals who had successfully turned their lives around. Elon's team at Tesla and SpaceX helped with logistical support, while various philanthropic organizations offered funding. Their mission was slowly but surely coming together, and the first spark of the idea began to glow brighter. They weren't just going to provide a place for people to sleep. They were going to provide a place where they could rebuild their lives. But just as they were starting to get momentum, they hit their first major roadblock. One morning, as Elon and John sat in the conference room, the mood was tense. Elon's assistant walked in with a serious expression on her face. Elon, we've got a problem, she said, placing a folder on the table. Elon's brows furrowed. What's going on? The assistant glanced at John before speaking. There's been some backlash. A group of activists is saying that your approach is too top-down. They claim that you're trying to impose your vision on people without understanding the nuances of their situation. They're saying you're treating homelessness like a business problem. John felt a pang of discomfort at the mention of the activists. He knew that many people were skeptical of Elon's motivations. There were always critics when it came to ambitious, high-profile projects, but this was personal to him. He didn't want anyone to think that Elon was just another billionaire trying to fix a problem he didn't understand. Elon looked up, his face unreadable. Well, we knew this was coming, he said after a beat. It's always going to be a challenge when you're trying to do something different, but we can't let that stop us. John nodded in agreement. We've got to prove that it works. Actions speak louder than words. Elon's eyes glinted with determination. Exactly. Let them criticize. We'll show them that this approach works. One life at a time. And so, despite the early criticism, Elon and John pressed on. They knew that their mission was just beginning, and that there would be obstacles along the way. But they also knew that this was bigger than anything they had ever done before. And with that in mind, they were ready to face whatever came next. The pressure was mounting. As Elon and John's idea began to gain traction, the challenges also started to stack up. There were critics, logistical nightmares, and the constant question of whether they could actually make a meaningful impact in such a complex, deeply entrenched issue. But despite the skepticism and difficulties, they kept moving forward. The first tangible step toward their vision came when they secured a location, a former industrial building on the edge of Los Angeles. It wasn't much to look at yet, just an empty, echoing space full of dust and faded walls. But to Elon and John, it was the beginning of something revolutionary. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Elon's team helped with the structural improvements, and contractors were brought in to transform the space into a livable environment. Meanwhile, John worked on building the community aspect. He reached out to local shelters and support organizations, convincing them to partner in this ambitious new venture. The idea was clear. This would be a place where people could rebuild, not just get by. It was a holistic model: housing, job training, counseling, community involvement. But the most important aspect was that it would be a place where people could find their worth again. As the building started to take shape, Elon and John found themselves back at the drawing board, refining the core aspects of their program. How would they select people to enter the program? What would the structure look like day to day? Would it be enough to just give people a chance? Or would they need more? More guidance, more support, more care? One afternoon, as they sat in the half-finished facility, Elon looked at John, his expression thoughtful. We can't just give people a place to stay and expect them to turn their lives around. We need to provide real tools, real mentorship, and not just from us, other people who have been through it. People who understand what it's like to lose everything and come back. John agreed. Exactly. People don't need a handout. They need a hand up. They need guidance from someone who's been there, someone who's fought to make it through the worst. And they need to feel like they belong, like they have a place in this world again. Elon nodded. He had heard the same thing from various experts, but it was different hearing it from John. This wasn't some corporate initiative for the sake of charity or PR. It was personal. This was about creating a genuine community where every person, regardless of their past, had the chance to rebuild. It was a mission rooted in empathy. The first group of individuals to enter the program was small, just 20 people. John helped with the selection process, meeting with local shelters to find people who were motivated but needed support. They were looking for people who were willing to work hard and take responsibility for their future. They wanted individuals who would be active participants in the program, not just recipients of handouts. When the day finally came for the first group to arrive, the atmosphere was electric, full of hope and uncertainty. The 20 individuals were a mix of ages, backgrounds, and personal stories. Some had been homeless for just a few months, while others had been living on the streets for years. But they all had one thing in common. They were ready for a change. As they walked into the facility, their faces were a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism. It was clear they had been through a lot. But there was something else in their eyes, too, a spark. They wanted to believe. They wanted to hope. Elon and John were there to greet them, each of them offering a few words of encouragement. John stepped forward first, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I know what it feels like to lose everything, he began, looking each person in the eye. I know what it's like to feel invisible, like you've been forgotten. But today that changes. You are not forgotten. You matter. And we are going to help you rebuild. Together. Elon followed, his usual businesslike demeanor softened by the gravity of the situation. I'm here because I believe in you. I believe that anyone can turn their life around if they're given the right tools, the right support, and the right environment. And that's what we're giving you here. A chance to rebuild, from the ground up. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of their words sinking in. Then, slowly, a few heads nodded. And for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of hope in the room. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, this time things could be different. Over the next few months, the facility began to take on a life of its own. The first group of participants were slowly integrated into the system. They attended classes on job training, financial literacy, and mental health support. They were paired with mentors, people who had successfully turned their lives around and were now giving back. They were given the tools to not just survive, but thrive. And most importantly, they were given something they hadn't had in a long time: dignity. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, frustrations, and moments of doubt. Some of the participants struggled with the transition, and a few even dropped out of the program. But for every setback, there were successes, small wins that began to add up. One person found a job. Another reconnected with family. Someone else began to address long-buried mental health issues that had been holding them back. John was particularly invested in one individual, Sarah, a woman in her late 30s who had been homeless for over 5 years. She had a story similar to his own. Once successful, but gradually losing everything due to addiction and bad decisions. Sarah was hesitant at first, but she had a determination in her eyes that reminded John of his younger self. Over the course of the program, John worked closely with Sarah, mentoring her through her setbacks and helping her regain the confidence she had lost. It wasn't an easy road, but Sarah was making progress, slowly but surely. One evening, as they sat in the common area of the facility, Sarah turned to John. You know, she said, her voice soft, I didn't think I could ever get back to where I was. I thought my life was over. But being here, I don't know. I feel like I have a second chance. I don't know if I'll ever be the same person I was before, but that's okay. I don't want to be her anymore. I just want to move forward. John smiled, a deep, genuine smile. That's all any of us can do. Move forward. And you're doing it, one step at a time. But as the program progressed, Elon and John knew they couldn't rest on their laurels. They needed to expand. They needed to reach more people. They had to prove that their model could work on a larger scale. They began planning the next phase, expanding their model into other cities. But there were obstacles to overcome. Funding would need to be secured. Local governments would need to be on board. And above all, they needed to maintain the integrity of their mission. It wasn't just about numbers. It was about real lives. But with every new step, with every new success, they were more convinced than ever that they were on the right path. They had already changed lives in one facility, and now they were ready to do it again, on a much larger scale. The question wasn't if they could succeed. It was how many lives they could touch along the way. And that thought gave Elon and John the fuel to keep going, even when the road ahead seemed daunting. As the months went on, the small pilot program in Los Angeles began to show real promise. People who had entered the program broken and lost were slowly but surely transforming. The most heartening part wasn't just the change in their circumstances. It was the change in their mindset. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were learning to live, to dream, and to hope again. But success, as Elon and John both knew, brought its own set of challenges. The demand for the program was growing. People from other parts of California, and even from out of state, were reaching out, asking if they could be part of the initiative. John was thrilled by the response. He had always known that there were so many others out there who needed help, but he also knew that this was a delicate moment. Scaling up too quickly could dilute the program's effectiveness. If they weren't careful, they could lose sight of the very thing that made it successful, a personal, hands-on approach. Elon, who had a history of rapidly expanding his ventures, was excited but cautious. "We've got to be strategic," he said one morning during a meeting. "The next step is crucial. We need to be sure that as we grow, we don't lose the heart of what we've built. We can't just copy and paste this program into other cities. It has to be customized for each location. The needs of people in San Francisco, for example, could be different from those in Dallas or Miami." John nodded, understanding completely. "I get it. We can't just scale the buildings. We need to scale the relationships, the mentorship. That's what's made this work so far." Elon leaned forward, tapping the table with his fingers. "Exactly. But we also need to bring in more people. We're going to need more mentors, more trainers, more specialists. This can't just be a handful of us doing everything. We need to create a network of people who are committed to making this work." It was a daunting thought, but Elon was right. If they were going to take this thing nationwide, they needed to build a robust system of support that could handle the unique needs of each person entering the program. The first step in scaling was to bring in more experts, people who could help build the infrastructure necessary to replicate the program. Elon reached out to his network of engineers, architects, and business leaders. The goal wasn't just to create a physical space. They needed to design a system that could be replicated across cities and regions without losing its personal touch. John, on the other hand, began working on recruiting mentors, people who had successfully turned their lives around and were willing to give back. He knew that the most powerful tool in their arsenal was the personal connection, the chance to learn from someone who had walked the same difficult road. As they began to expand, there was another key element they had to address: public perception. The program was gaining attention, and not all of it was positive. There were critics who still viewed the initiative as a rich guy's project, a top-down solution to a bottom-up problem. Some saw it as a publicity stunt, or worse, an attempt to impose Silicon Valley ideals onto an issue that required more nuanced solutions. John had heard the criticism, but he refused to let it shake him. "People are going to question us. They're going to say we don't know what we're doing. But you know what? We're not pretending to have all the answers. We're just trying to help. We're showing up, we're listening, and we're learning." Elon agreed. And that's the key. We're willing to admit when we don't have all the answers. That's why we need to keep evolving, keep listening to people, keep adjusting our approach. The only way we fail is if we stop trying. But despite their determination, it was clear that they needed to prove themselves. The question was, how? How could they show that their approach, this combination of mentorship, resources, and real opportunities, could work on a larger scale? As the planning for expansion moved forward, John was invited to speak at a conference on homelessness and poverty in San Francisco. It was a huge opportunity, a chance to put their vision in front of a wider audience and, hopefully, bring more partners and supporters into the fold. Elon was supportive, of course. "You've got this, John," he said, as they prepared for the event. "Just speak from the heart. People will see the passion behind what you're doing." John wasn't nervous about the speech itself. He had plenty of experience sharing his story. What worried him more was how their program would be received. There was so much at stake. One bad review, one skeptical journalist, could set everything back. The day of the conference, John stood backstage, staring at the packed auditorium. The lights were bright, the room buzzing with the hum of anticipation. He could see some of the prominent activists and politicians in the audience, people who had been fighting homelessness for decades. He knew there would be people who questioned the viability of his and Elon's program, but he also knew that this was the moment to convince them that what they were doing was different. When it was finally his turn, he stepped onto the stage, taking a deep breath. For a moment, the microphone felt too heavy in his hand, and the eyes of the room felt like 1,000,000 pounds. But then he looked out into the crowd, and something clicked. These weren't just strangers. These were people who wanted to make a difference, just like him. And that's when he realized he wasn't just there to speak about their program. He was there to ask for their help, their support, their belief in this mission. He cleared his throat and began. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John, and I'm here to tell you about something I never thought I'd be a part of, a program that's changing lives. Not just temporarily, but for good." He went on to explain the model they had developed in Los Angeles. He spoke about the success stories, people like Sarah, who had gone from living on the streets to finding stable employment. He talked about the mentorship aspect and how crucial it was for people to have someone who understood their struggles. He explained how Elon Musk's involvement was more than just financial. It was about giving people the tools to rebuild their lives from the ground up. But what truly resonated with the audience was the honesty in John's voice. He spoke not just as someone who had been part of the program, but as someone who had lived through the very things they were trying to solve. He shared his own story, the addiction, the loss, the hopelessness, and how, with the right support, he had been able to turn his life around. "We're not here to hand out charity," he concluded. "We're here to offer a lifeline. And we're asking for your help, because if we do this right, if we stay focused on the people and not just the numbers, we can change the narrative on homelessness in this country. We can show that everyone, no matter their past, has the power to rebuild their life." There was a long pause after he finished speaking, and then, to his surprise, the room erupted into applause. The sincerity of his message had broken through. Even the most skeptical audience members were moved. The success of John's speech marked a turning point. It wasn't just about building more facilities or expanding into new cities. It was about shifting the entire conversation around homelessness, about showing that these weren't just statistics. These were real people with real potential who simply needed the opportunity to rise. By the end of the conference, several major philanthropic organizations had reached out, expressing interest in partnering with Elon and John. There were now offers for funding, resources, and even political backing. As John walked off the stage, his heart was racing, but there was also a deep sense of relief. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like they were really onto something. And with that, they took the first real step toward their next phase, scaling their vision to a national level. The excitement from the San Francisco conference lingered in the air like a charged current. Offers of partnerships, financial backing, and media coverage flooded in. It was clear that the idea John and Elon had crafted was beginning to take hold on a much larger scale. The momentum was palpable. But with that momentum came new pressures. More people to manage, more expectations, and a mountain of logistical hurdles that felt increasingly overwhelming. Elon, always the visionary, was ready to charge ahead and scale the program rapidly. But John, who had always been the more cautious of the two, knew that expansion would require more than just good intentions. They would need a clear, sustainable plan that could withstand the pressures of growth. As they sat down to discuss their next move, John raised his concerns. "I know we have a lot of support right now, and that's great. But if we're going to expand this successfully, we can't just rush in. We need a solid framework. We need to be able to replicate what we've done in Los Angeles, but we can't lose sight of the human aspect that made it work in the first place. Elon nodded thoughtfully, his fingers tapping the surface of the conference table. I get it. You're right. The key is to build a scalable model, but it's not just about the physical space. It's about the culture. We need to create a network of mentors, people who are committed to the vision, who will take this same approach wherever we go. We can't do it alone. The plan began to take shape over the next several months. They would expand first to 3 cities, San Francisco, Miami, and Dallas. Each city would serve as a pilot location for scaling the program in a way that would reflect its unique needs. In each city, they would partner with local shelters, community organizations, and businesses to build a solid foundation before they opened the doors to new participants. The team grew quickly. Elon brought in more specialists, designers who could help create a sustainable, eco-friendly living space, business leaders who could help with fundraising and long-term strategy, and tech experts who could help streamline the administrative side of the program. John worked tirelessly with local activists, social workers, and mental health professionals, making sure that the program in each city was grounded in empathy and understanding. By the time the facilities in San Francisco, Miami, and Dallas were ready to open, it was clear that what they were building was far more than just a place for people to sleep. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a community. Opening day came fast. Each of the new centers had been transformed from vacant spaces into bustling, hopeful environments. In San Francisco, a former office building had been turned into a clean, modern space with room for individuals and families, as well as a dedicated counseling and job training center. In Miami, they had taken over a repurposed warehouse by the water, with lush gardens that provided a serene escape for those struggling with the anxiety and trauma of homelessness. And in Dallas, they had renovated an old school, giving it a sense of permanence and stability. The first group of participants arrived at each location, each one carrying a story of struggle, hope, and resilience. Just as they had done in Los Angeles, John and Elon were there to greet them, offering words of encouragement and support. The process of integration began. New arrivals were introduced to their mentors, their counselors, and their peers. It was a humbling experience for everyone involved. For John, it was a reminder of how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. In each city, there were the inevitable growing pains. A few of the new participants were skeptical. Some had been let down by systems before and weren't sure whether this program would be any different. Others, like Sarah in Los Angeles, struggled with deep-rooted issues that made transitioning into the program a monumental challenge. But with the support of their mentors, the community began to build. For every person who doubted the process, there was another who found the courage to try. For Elon, it was a reminder of why he did what he did. Yes, he had made billions. Yes, he had created companies that had revolutionized industries. But none of that mattered as much as this. This was about making a difference in the lives of real people. This was about creating something that would leave a lasting legacy. The journey ahead was still uncertain, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks and challenges. But together, they had created something meaningful. And with each new center, each new life touched, they knew that they were building not just homes, but a new future. A future where no one had to feel invisible again. And that, in the end, was worth all the effort. As the program expanded across cities, what had once felt like an unstoppable force began to encounter its first significant setback. It wasn't the lack of resources or the challenges of scaling the program that caused the problem. Those were things they had anticipated and worked hard to address. No, this was something more insidious, an unexpected backlash from the very communities they were trying to help. At first, it was subtle, small murmurs of discontent. A few participants in the Dallas Center began to voice frustrations about the program structure, the level of discipline required, and the expectations placed on them. Some complained that the mentors were too hard on them, or that they weren't receiving enough personal attention. And then, a few weeks later, the first major incident occurred. A man named Tony, a middle-aged former construction worker from Miami, had been participating in the program for a little over a month. He had shown early signs of success. He'd made significant progress in overcoming his alcohol addiction and was well on his way to securing a stable job. But one afternoon, he disappeared. He didn't show up for a group therapy session, didn't attend his job training, and when his mentor, Janet, went looking for him, she found his belongings gone from his room. It was a massive blow. Janet had worked closely with Tony, and his disappearance felt like a personal failure. John took it hard too. "What happened?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern. He was doing so well. But it wasn't just Tony's absence that was alarming. It was the ripple effect it caused. Other participants began to express doubts about the program's approach. "It's too much, too fast," one man, Deshaun, said during a group session. "I'm not used to all this. It feels like they're trying to turn us into something we're not. Like we have to fit into their mold." John had always prided himself on creating a program that was flexible, adaptable to the individual. But now it felt like the cracks were starting to show. There was an unease in the air, a sense that not everyone was ready for this level of change. Not everyone was ready to leave behind the only life they had known, even if that life had been filled with pain and hardship. That evening, John met with Elon to discuss the growing concerns. They had come so far, and the last thing they wanted was for their program to be seen as just another well-meaning but ineffective initiative. Elon listened carefully as John laid out his worries. "We've got to fix this, Elon," John said. "We're at a tipping point. If we don't listen and adjust, it could unravel everything. We have to find a way to support these people in a way that's more personalized. It's not just about getting them into jobs or off the streets. It's about helping them rebuild their sense of self." Elon's usual sharp focus softened a bit as he considered John's words. "You're right," Elon said slowly. "Maybe we've been too focused on scaling and not enough on the individual journey. But we can't let that stop us. We'll just have to refine the approach." The two of them brainstormed late into the night. They agreed that the next step was not just to expand the program, but to overhaul certain aspects of it. There needed to be more emphasis on emotional support, therapy, and mentorship that was less structured, more flexible, and more accessible. They would also introduce a more gradual transition plan, one that allowed participants to move at their own pace, rather than pushing them to take giant leaps forward. The next morning, John called a meeting with all of the mentors and local program directors. He shared the feedback they'd received and explained that they would be making some adjustments to the program to make it more adaptable. The team listened intently, and then one of the mentors, Karen, spoke up. "I think we've been pushing people too hard," Karen said. "We've got to meet them where they are, not where we think they should be. Everyone's story is different, and everyone's pace is different. We need to let people grow, not just force them into a mold." There was a collective nod around the table. They all knew the program's success was not just about providing shelter. It was about providing the right kind of emotional and mental framework to help people heal. In the weeks that followed, they made several key changes. First, they introduced a more personalized intake process, where each new participant was paired with a mentor who had a similar background or experience. This helped build trust early on, as participants felt like their mentors truly understood them. They also added more one-on-one therapy sessions and group counseling, focusing on trauma recovery and self-worth rather than just skill building. The most important change, however, was the introduction of a graduation system. Instead of pushing participants to conform to a set timeline or set of goals, they gave people more control over their own progress. They created a clear structure for what it would take for someone to move from one stage of the program to the next, but participants could decide when they were ready for each step. This allowed them to reclaim ownership over their own journey. The first test of the new approach came in Dallas, when another participant, Marcus, was ready to move on to the next phase of the program, job training. But Marcus, a young man who had spent most of his life in and out of foster homes, was apprehensive. He wasn't sure he was ready to work. His mentor, Sarah, sat with him for hours, talking through his fears and anxieties. She reassured him that it was okay to be scared, but that taking small steps was how he could overcome his past. It was a pivotal moment, not just for Marcus, but for the entire program. By respecting his pace and not rushing him, Sarah helped him realize that the fear of failure wasn't as paralyzing as he had thought. Marcus eventually enrolled in a job training course, though it took him longer than some of the other participants. And when he landed his first part-time job in a local coffee shop a few months later, it wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for the entire approach they had begun to implement. As the months went by, the new adjustments paid off. Word began to spread that the program wasn't just about putting a roof over people's heads. It was about restoring their dignity, their confidence, and their belief in themselves. People who had been homeless for years were starting to turn their lives around in ways they hadn't thought possible. In Miami, a man named Elijah, who had been living on the streets for over 5 years, was now working full-time at a construction company. His first few weeks in the program had been rocky. He had resisted help, afraid that it would be just another failed attempt at getting back on his feet. But with a personalized plan and the support of his mentor, he had gradually started rebuilding his life. "I didn't think I could do this," Elijah admitted one day to John, tears in his eyes. "I thought it was too late for me. But you guys gave me a chance when no one else would. And now, I'm doing it. I'm really doing it." The road to success had never been linear. There had been stumbles, setbacks, and moments when John and Elon questioned if their vision was even possible. But now, with the right adjustments in place, they saw the fruits of their labor. More and more participants were graduating from the program, finding jobs, securing stable housing, and rebuilding relationships with their families. It was clear that the program wasn't just helping people survive, it was helping them thrive. As they prepared to open more centers in other cities, John knew that the work was far from over. There would always be new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But they had built a foundation, one rooted in understanding, empathy, and respect that could weather anything. And so, the journey continued. It wasn't just about homes, it was about hearts and the power of second chances. As the program grew and expanded into new cities, John and Elon saw something unexpected happening. The ripple effect of their work reached beyond the participants, beyond the mentors and the staff. It spread into entire communities. The homeless crisis, which had once been a silent epidemic that people turned away from, began to demand attention. It started with the people who lived in the neighborhoods where their centers had been established. At first, many had been skeptical. Local residents and business owners had questioned what a homeless shelter might do to property values or to the safety of their streets. They had heard the same old stories about how helping people on the streets might attract more issues, more crime, more problems. But over time, as the new centers began to show their true impact, that skepticism slowly turned into support. People saw the individuals who had once been on the streets of San Francisco, Miami, and Dallas, now walking with pride, heading off to work, talking about their recovery, and reconnecting with their families. They saw the businesses in the area thriving, as the program partnered with local enterprises to give participants job opportunities. Slowly, the narrative started to shift. This wasn't just a homeless shelter. This was a community transformation effort. One afternoon, in San Francisco, a local cafe owner named Tanya approached John. She had been watching the program's impact on the neighborhood for months. "You know, when you first opened this center, I was worried," Tanya admitted. "I thought things were going to get worse around here. But honestly, I see more people coming in and out of your center now than I do in most of the other businesses on the block. And a lot of them, they've turned their lives around. They've got jobs. They're paying rent. You're making this place better, not worse. And I just wanted to thank you." John smiled, the compliment feeling like a weight lifted off his chest. "It's not just us," he replied, his tone humble. "It's the people we're helping. They're the ones doing the work. All we're doing is giving them the tools." As the program continued to receive more attention, larger philanthropic organizations and private donors began to take note. While John had been hesitant at first to accept large sums of money from corporate entities, he knew that in order to sustain and scale the program, they would need financial support. After careful consideration, he and Elon agreed to form partnerships with some of the biggest names in business, while making sure to keep the program grounded in its mission. One of the first major sponsors they secured was a prominent tech company in Silicon Valley. The company's CEO, an advocate for social responsibility, had been watching their progress with great interest. He proposed a partnership. The tech company would provide funding and resources in exchange for opportunities to integrate their technologies into the program, such as helping to create a more efficient, tech-driven case management system for participants. While the idea of integrating corporate interests into the program was uncomfortable for John, he understood that this partnership could bring enormous benefits. The funding would allow them to expand to even more cities and fine-tune their services, while the technology would streamline administrative processes, making the program more efficient and scalable. John and Elon knew they had to tread carefully. They were still committed to keeping the human element at the center of everything. But if they played it right, this could be the key to turning their vision into a movement that could extend across the country. Months passed, and the team worked tirelessly to integrate the new systems. They rolled out new tech tools to help participants track their progress, communicate with mentors, and access job opportunities. They also began to expand their services to include mental health treatment, addiction counseling, and family therapy, resources that were previously unavailable to many people experiencing homelessness. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of community engagement days in each of the cities they served. These were open events where local residents could come in, meet the participants, hear their stories, and even volunteer to support the program. John and Elon knew that building understanding between those who had experienced homelessness and the larger community would be essential for long-term success. At the first community engagement event in Miami, John watched as a mother and son approached a group of participants who were discussing their experiences in the program. The mother had tears in her eyes as she listened to a woman named Andrea, who had been homeless for 3 years before entering the program. "I was afraid for my son," the woman explained, her voice shaky. "He was about to go down the same path I did, into addiction, into a life on the streets. But I found this place, and they didn't give up on me. I didn't think I could do it, but now I'm working again. I'm sober. And my son, he's in school. He's safe." The mother's face softened, and she stepped forward, extending her hand. "Thank you. I know my son has seen what you've been through, and I think he believes he can make it too." It was moments like this, John thought, that made all the hardships of the past year worth it. They weren't just changing lives, they were changing communities, shifting the way people saw the homeless and offering real hope for the future. But not everything was going smoothly. Even as the program grew and garnered support, there were still occasional failures. There were people who fell through the cracks, people who relapsed, or couldn't handle the pressure of the program's expectations. There were families who arrived with emotional baggage so heavy that even the best therapists couldn't seem to reach them. And there were those, like Tony, who simply couldn't adapt to the structure and support. They were lost in the shuffle, a harsh reminder that even the best systems couldn't solve every problem. One of those people was James, a 32-year-old man who had spent most of his life in and out of the prison system. After completing his sentence, he had no place to go, and homelessness had become his reality. His mentor, a woman named Claire, had worked with him for several months. They discussed job opportunities, his past, his future. But James was stuck in a rut. He couldn't seem to move forward. Every time he started to make progress, he would fall back. "It's like I'm trying to climb out of a hole, but every time I get halfway up, the ground shifts and I fall back down," James admitted one night during their weekly meeting. His eyes were glassy, a sign of the years of pain he had buried deep inside. Claire didn't have all the answers, but she knew that this was part of the process. Not every success would be linear. But she also knew that the program couldn't afford to give up on people like James, no matter how long it took. "We're not giving up on you, James. We're not going anywhere. You don't have to climb alone." As the year came to a close, John and Elon took a step back and reflected on how far they had come. The program was in 6 cities now, with more set to open soon. They had impacted hundreds of lives, transformed neighborhoods, and garnered support from across the business and philanthropic worlds. Yet despite all the progress, they both knew that the real work was just beginning. The ripple effect was growing, and with it, the realization that true change wasn't just about offering a home. It was about fostering a sense of belonging, hope, and opportunity. It was about breaking down the walls of judgment and building up the confidence of those who had long been forgotten. They had started with a simple question, and it had blossomed into something much bigger, something that, with time, could truly change the way America viewed homelessness. The program's success in major cities like San Francisco, Dallas, and Miami was undeniable. Yet, as John and Elon had feared, the road to transformation was not without its challenges. The broader societal issues that had allowed homelessness to become such an entrenched problem would take much longer to address. Poverty, mental illness, substance abuse, and lack of affordable housing were systemic issues that no single program, no matter how well designed, could fix overnight. But John believed that what they were doing was a start, and that, in time, their approach could become a model for how to solve homelessness nationwide. Still, despite their progress, there were moments of doubt. It was in the late spring of the second year of their program when John received an email that would change the course of everything they had worked for. It was from a reporter at the New York Times, asking for an interview about the program's success. While it might have seemed like a typical request, this journalist had a history of exposing cracks in well-intentioned initiatives. He had an eye for finding flaws. John paused, staring at the email for several minutes before replying. He knew that the media could either amplify their message or tear it apart. He had seen what happened to other social projects that got too big, too fast. There was always someone looking for the story that could bring it down. After a brief discussion with Elon, they agreed to go ahead with the interview, determined to face any criticism head-on. After all, if their program truly worked, it would stand up to scrutiny. The interview took place in a modest conference room at one of their centers in San Francisco. The reporter, a seasoned journalist named Mark Peterson, arrived punctually. He was a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a business suit that seemed a bit too formal for the laid-back vibe of the center. "So," Mark began, after introducing himself and setting up his recorder, "this program of yours, it's gotten a lot of attention. But people are asking, what happens to the ones who don't succeed? We've heard about the success stories, but I'm curious about the failures. What do you do when someone relapses? Or when a participant falls through the cracks?" John was prepared for this line of questioning. He took a deep breath and leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. "Mark, we're not perfect. We're human, and so are the people we serve," John said. "We've had our setbacks. Some people don't make it through the program. Some relapse. Some fall behind. But we never give up on them. This isn't about success in the traditional sense. It's about giving people the opportunity to rebuild their lives, no matter how many times they stumble. Failure isn't the end. It's just part of the journey." Elon, who had been sitting quietly next to John, spoke up. "We've had to adapt our approach because the problem isn't just homelessness. It's everything that leads to it. It's addiction, trauma, mental illness, broken families. And those things don't get fixed overnight. So, yes, we have our setbacks. But we also have people who are thriving." Mark didn't seem entirely convinced. "But how do you respond to critics who say that this is just another Band-Aid solution? How do you answer to people who say that you're not addressing the root causes?" John paused, choosing his words carefully. "We don't claim to solve all of society's problems. What we're doing is offering a lifeline to people who have been forgotten. We're not saying we can fix everything, but we're doing what we can, one life at a time. And I think that counts for something." The interview continued for over an hour, with Mark pressing John and Elon on various aspects of the program. In the end, it was clear that Mark wasn't going to give them an easy ride, but neither was he dismissing the program entirely. When the interview concluded, he stood up and shook their hands. "I'll need time to write the piece, but I'll say this. I think you've got something here," Mark said. "I'll be honest, I'm skeptical, but I respect what you're trying to do." A few days later, the article was published. The headline was simple but striking. "Can a homeless program actually work? Inside a revolutionary new initiative that's changing lives, one at a time." The article itself was a balanced mix of praise and caution. Mark acknowledged the success of the program in transforming the lives of many participants, but he also highlighted the challenges, especially when it came to relapse and long-term sustainability. He interviewed several program participants, and while many spoke positively about the changes they had experienced, others admitted that they were still struggling. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? But what stood out most in the article was Mark's conclusion. Homelessness is a complex issue, and no single initiative can provide a panacea. However, this program is changing the way we think about recovery and rehabilitation. It's not a quick fix, but it might be the first step towards something bigger, something that could, eventually, change the course of homelessness in America. The article hit the media like a wave. Social media platforms buzzed with reactions, Some praised the program for its innovation, while others questioned whether it could truly scale. The mixed reactions were both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the article provided an opportunity to highlight the program's successes and discuss how it was evolving to address its challenges. On the other, it reminded John and Elon that they were not immune to criticism. As the weeks passed, John found himself responding to emails, phone calls, and social media comments more than he ever had before. Some were filled with gratitude, from individuals who had experienced homelessness and felt that the program gave them a chance at a new life. Others were skeptical, challenging whether the program could truly change the systemic issues that caused homelessness in the first place. But the most unexpected response came from an unlikely source. It was a Sunday afternoon when John received a phone call from someone he hadn't heard from in years, his former college professor, Dr. Elizabeth Reiner. "John, I just read the article." Dr. Reiner's voice crackled through the phone line. "And I have to say, I'm impressed. I've been following your work from afar, but seeing it all come together like this, well, it's remarkable." John smiled, though he could hear the concern in Dr. Reiner's voice. "Thank you, Elizabeth. It's been a long road, but we're just getting started." She paused before speaking again. "I've always believed that you could do something big, John, but I also know how hard this work is. Are you prepared for the next phase? Because it's going to get even harder. Scaling this program isn't just about more centers and more money. It's about changing hearts and minds. The real work, John, is changing how people see homelessness." Her words hit home. It was true. As much as they had accomplished, they were still up against years of ingrained stigma and systemic neglect. "We're ready," John replied. "We've learned from our mistakes, and we're going to keep pushing forward. But we can't do it alone. We need partners. We need people who believe in this vision." "Well, you've got me," Dr. Reiner said with a chuckle. "And I think you'll find that there are many more out there who are ready to stand with you. Just be prepared. There will always be those who want to see you fail. The key is remembering why you started." The weeks following the article were filled with high-stakes meetings and countless new partnerships. John and Elon met with government officials, business leaders, and other nonprofits. They were determined to prove that their program could be the blueprint for nationwide change. But despite the growing support, John couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was a turning point. The honeymoon phase was over. The real work was about to begin. He thought about the countless individuals who had walked through their doors, each one carrying their own burdens, their own stories. Some had made it out of the darkness. Others were still fighting their demons. But for all of them, this program had given them something more important than a roof over their heads. It had given them hope. And John was determined to hold on to that hope, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The weeks following the article in the New York Times were a whirlwind. The media spotlight was both a blessing and a burden. John and Elon had prepared themselves for increased scrutiny, but they hadn't anticipated how quickly the program would draw the attention of so many people, both supportive and critical. With newfound visibility came a series of challenges they hadn't fully anticipated, and the pressure to perform was intensifying. For John, it wasn't the increased media attention that worried him the most. It was the expectations that now came with it. They had made strides, yes, but scaling the program to a national level meant confronting entrenched societal issues that were much larger than their initial focus on homelessness. John sat at his desk late one evening, staring at a proposal for a new center in Los Angeles. It was a massive undertaking, requiring funding, community buy-in, and most importantly, political support. Los Angeles had one of the highest rates of homelessness in the nation, and the city's approach to addressing the crisis had been inconsistent at best. Over the past few years, several initiatives had been proposed, only to fall apart due to political gridlock, mismanagement, or lack of resources. John knew that launching a center in LA wouldn't be easy, but it was crucial. If they could succeed in such a high-profile city, they could prove that their model worked at scale. He glanced at his phone. Elon had just sent a text. "We need to be in LA. Let's set up a meeting with the mayor next week. We can't afford to wait." John nodded to himself. Elon was right. They had to take bold steps now, before the window of opportunity closed. But the path ahead wasn't clear. Los Angeles was a city with a lot of moving parts. A large homeless population, a diverse set of stakeholders, and entrenched political interests that often stood in the way of progress. They would need to get everyone on board. The next week, John and Elon flew to Los Angeles to meet with local government officials and advocates. They met with the mayor, several city council members, and representatives from local homeless advocacy groups. Despite the program's success in other cities, John quickly realized that Los Angeles was a different beast altogether. The political landscape was more complex, the challenges more deeply rooted. At their first meeting with the mayor, the conversation turned quickly to logistics. How will this program differ from what we've tried before? Mayor Rodriguez asked, leaning back in his chair. We've seen countless initiatives come and go. What makes you think yours will succeed where others have failed? John felt the weight of the question, but answered with confidence. We're not just providing a bed or a meal. We're offering a comprehensive approach that includes job training, mental health services, addiction recovery, and housing. And perhaps most importantly, we're not just offering solutions, we're offering second chances. Many of these individuals just need the opportunity to prove they can turn their lives around. Elon chimed in, we've seen it work in other cities. It's not about a one-size-fits-all model. It's about tailoring the support to the needs of the community and the individuals we're serving. The mayor listened intently, but there was a flicker of skepticism in his eyes. I'm not opposed to the idea, but we need hard numbers. We need to know that your program can actually work here, in a city as big and diverse as LA. This isn't like San Francisco or Miami. The scale is different, the issues are different. It was clear that the mayor was looking for more than just promises. He wanted concrete evidence that their program could make a real impact. We can provide that, Elon said. We've been gathering data from our existing centers, and we're happy to share it with you. We've seen consistent improvements in employment rates, mental health recovery, and permanent housing placements in every city we've expanded to. We've learned from our mistakes, and we know what works. The mayor seemed to consider this for a moment. All right, let's start small. I'll set up a working group with your team. If we can prove the model works on a smaller scale here, we'll talk about scaling it further. John felt a sense of relief. It wasn't a total win, but it was a step forward. The mayor wasn't fully on board yet, but at least he was willing to give them a chance. The next few months were a blur of meetings, negotiations, and preparations. They secured a small location in downtown LA to start their pilot program, focusing on a neighborhood that had one of the highest concentrations of homeless individuals in the city. They worked closely with local shelters, social service organizations, and businesses to build partnerships and gain support from the community. Despite their best efforts, they ran into resistance from a number of local businesses and residents who feared that the program would bring crime and instability to the area. Some even argued that it would attract more homeless people from other parts of the city, exacerbating the problem. It was a tough battle, but John remained hopeful. A breakthrough came one morning when John received an unexpected phone call. It was Tanya, the cafe owner from San Francisco who had spoken so highly of the program months ago. Tanya had been following their efforts to expand to Los Angeles, and she had some advice. John, I know what it's like to face the opposition of people who don't understand what you're doing. But here's what I've learned from running my cafe in that neighborhood. Sometimes the best way to change people's minds is by showing them the impact firsthand. Get them involved. Get the community involved. Tanya was right. The more John thought about it, the more he realized that he had been focusing too much on convincing people who were already skeptical. Instead, they needed to engage the community directly, to show them that this wasn't just a program for the homeless, but for everyone. John took Tanya's advice to heart and set up a community engagement day at their LA center. They invited local businesses, residents, and community leaders to come in, meet the participants, and hear their stories. They also organized volunteer opportunities so that people could directly contribute to the program's success. The event was a success beyond their expectations. Local business owners who had initially been skeptical came in, talked to participants, and saw firsthand the work that was being done. One of the most impactful moments came when a local restaurant owner named Mario spoke with a young woman named Michelle, who had been in the program for 6 months. Michelle told Mario about how she had been living on the streets for over a year, struggling with addiction and feeling like she had no way out. But after joining the program, she had been given the resources to recover. She was now working part-time at a local cafe and had reconnected with her daughter, who she hadn't seen in years. Mario, visibly moved, told Michelle, "I had no idea. You don't see the real stories, not until you hear them. I'm going to talk to my team. I think we can offer some job opportunities here." That was the turning point. When the community began to see the human faces behind the issue of homelessness, when they saw the people who were actively working to rebuild their lives, everything began to change. By the end of the year, the Los Angeles pilot program was a success. They had placed over 50 participants into stable housing, and many had secured full-time jobs. The community was slowly starting to see the impact, and the mayor had begun to warm to the idea of expanding the program to other parts of the city. But John knew that this was just one victory in a much larger battle. The work was far from over. Still, as he sat in his office late one evening, looking over the data from LA, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. They had broken through a major barrier, not just in Los Angeles, but in the way the public viewed homelessness. The more they engaged with the community, the more they saw that the solution wasn't just about providing housing. It was about providing hope, dignity, and opportunity. And for the first time in a long while, John felt certain of one thing. They were on the right path. The success of their pilot program in Los Angeles was a beacon of hope. Despite the many challenges they had faced, the program had proven that with the right combination of empathy, resources, and community involvement, real change was possible. But John knew that the work was far from finished. The idea that homelessness was a problem that could be solved within a few short years was naive. The issues at the heart of homelessness, poverty, mental health, addiction, were deeply rooted, and the work to address them would require sustained effort, collaboration, and significant investment. The media buzz that had followed the New York Times article and the Los Angeles pilot program only intensified as the program gained momentum. National outlets like NBC News, CNN, and the Washington Post were calling for interviews, eager to report on the progress that had been made. The world seemed to be watching, and John was beginning to feel the weight of that scrutiny more than ever before. One morning, as John was in the middle of preparing for a meeting with a major donor in New York, he received an unexpected call. It was from Mayor Rodriguez's office in Los Angeles. "John, we've got some exciting news," the mayor's assistant said. "The Los Angeles City Council just approved funding for an expansion of your program. We're going to open 5 more centers across the city." John's heart skipped a beat. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. They were about to get the kind of institutional backing they needed to scale their efforts significantly. "That's incredible news," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Thank you. We're thrilled to hear this." "It's not just about expanding the centers," the assistant continued. "The mayor's office is also working with state and federal agencies to secure additional funding and resources for the program. They're seeing the impact firsthand and want to make this a citywide priority." John felt the weight of the moment. This was the kind of political will that could make a real difference. He had been skeptical of the political process at times, especially after seeing how quickly other initiatives had faltered under bureaucratic pressure. But this felt different. This was a sign that the city was ready to back their vision. "I can't tell you how much this means," John said, his voice tinged with emotion. "We'll do everything we can to make this expansion a success." The announcement of the expansion came just days after another phone call, this one from an unlikely source. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. "John," Bezos said, when he picked up the phone, "I've been following your work closely, and I think what you're doing is nothing short of revolutionary. I want to help." John was taken aback. He had always respected Bezos as a business leader, but he hadn't expected a call like this. "What kind of help are you offering?" John asked cautiously. "I'd like to contribute a significant donation to help fund the expansion of your program, specifically in Los Angeles. I've been thinking a lot about the issue of homelessness, and I think your approach is one of the few that actually has the potential to work. You're not just putting people in temporary shelters, you're giving them real opportunities to rebuild their lives." John was stunned. The idea of Jeff Bezos, a billionaire known for his tech empire, backing a homeless initiative was not something he had anticipated. "I don't know what to say," John said, his voice shaking slightly. "This could change everything for us. We've been working hard to secure funding, but having someone like you involved, well, it's a game changer." "I know," Bezos replied, But more than just the money, I want to be involved. I want to meet the people you're working with, hear their stories, and see firsthand how we can scale this. That's when John realized that Bezos wasn't just offering a check. He wanted to be a partner, not just a benefactor. It was an unusual but powerful offer. As John hung up the phone, he felt a rush of excitement. The backing of both the city of Los Angeles and Jeff Bezos was a huge turning point. It meant that their program could now grow in ways they had only dreamed of, with the resources and political support to make it a national model. But it also meant more scrutiny. There were plenty of people who would question their motives. They had already seen how a lack of understanding could breed skepticism and fear, and the involvement of a tech billionaire like Bezos would no doubt stir up debate. Still, John felt confident. The program had proven itself in real ways, with real people. They were no longer just a startup initiative, they were a movement. And movements, John knew, had the power to change the world. Meanwhile, Elon was focusing on refining the technology that supported the program. A crucial aspect of their initiative was the data platform they had developed, which allowed them to track participants' progress in real time, from job training to mental health recovery to housing placement. The data wasn't just for monitoring, it was for learning. They needed to understand what worked and what didn't, and that meant constantly tweaking and improving their approach. In a meeting with Elon's team, John was amazed at how quickly things were moving. Elon had already started working on an AI-driven model that could predict which individuals were most likely to succeed in the program based on their previous experiences and background. The idea was to identify patterns in the data and tailor the program even more precisely to meet each person's unique needs. We're going to have a predictive model that can improve outcomes across the board, Elon explained, his eyes alight with excitement. We can look at data from all the centers and make real-time adjustments to how we allocate resources. We're going to make this as efficient and impactful as possible. John nodded, impressed. The potential of their program was expanding beyond anything he had imagined. With technology like this, they could help thousands of people more effectively, more quickly, and with greater precision. But with every success, there were new questions. As they expanded, John had to ask himself, what would success look like at a national level? How could they ensure that their model worked everywhere, not just in the cities where they had already proven their effectiveness? And what about the long term? Was the goal simply to provide a temporary lifeline, or could they fundamentally change the way America thought about homelessness, addiction, and mental health? The next few months brought more breakthroughs and more challenges. As the program expanded to new cities, they faced the unique challenges of each location. Chicago had a massive homeless population, but there were deep-seated political divisions that made partnerships difficult. New York City had a high-profile homeless crisis, but the bureaucratic hurdles were overwhelming. In each case, they found ways to adapt, to build alliances, and to stay true to their vision. And with each new partnership, with each new center, they came closer to achieving something truly revolutionary. A comprehensive, holistic approach to homelessness that didn't just aim to put a roof over people's heads, but to truly change their lives. But amid all the progress, John knew that there was still a long way to go. The road ahead was uncertain, and the pressure to deliver on their promises only intensified. He often thought back to that first day when he'd met Elon Musk. At the time, their program had seemed like a small idea, a dream even. But now, with the support of powerful allies and the momentum of their successes, it felt like they were on the verge of something much bigger. Homelessness was a national crisis, and they were determined to tackle it head-on. As the program continued to expand, John found himself stretched thinner than ever. Between meetings with mayors, city officials, corporate donors, and the growing list of volunteers, there was hardly a moment to catch his breath. What had started as a modest initiative had become a full-fledged movement, with hundreds of people across the country depending on the success of the program for their futures. John knew this was a critical time. They couldn't afford to falter now. The recent expansion into new cities was not without its difficulties. While Los Angeles had proven successful, cities like Chicago, New York, and Houston presented different sets of challenges. In some areas, there were entrenched attitudes about homelessness that made it difficult to win local support. In others, city budgets were tight, and convincing officials to allocate funds for the program was an uphill battle. But it wasn't just the external challenges that worried John. Internally, the program was facing growing pains. The staff, many of whom were volunteers at first, was now a much larger, more complex network. Keeping everyone on the same page while maintaining the program's core values was becoming increasingly difficult. They had to ensure that as they scaled, they didn't lose sight of the personal, human touch that had made their approach so successful. John sat in his office one late afternoon, sorting through the piles of paperwork that seemed to grow every day. His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was a text from Elon. "We need to meet. There's something we need to discuss about the new tech rollout." John raised an eyebrow. Elon was always looking ahead, always thinking 5 steps ahead, but this message felt different, urgent, even. The two met in person the next day, in one of the program's new centers in Chicago. The city had been one of the toughest to crack. Its homelessness issue was complex, tied to a range of economic, racial, and political factors. The program had just opened a small pilot center, but the results weren't as promising as they had hoped. While some participants were benefiting, others struggled to make progress in the face of systemic challenges. Elon paced in the small conference room, his face furrowed in thought. "I've been looking at the data," he said. "There's a fundamental problem with our approach here. The tech's working, no doubt about it, but we're not seeing the impact we should be. The outcomes aren't where they need to be." John leaned forward, listening intently. "What do you mean? The data looks solid across most cities, right?" "It's not the data that's the problem," Elon replied. "It's the people we're not reaching. The technology is helping those who are motivated and willing to make a change, but we're missing a huge portion of the population. Those who are so far gone, they don't believe they can change. They're entrenched in their addictions, their mental health issues, and they're not responding to the current model." John was silent for a moment, processing what Elon was saying. It was a difficult reality to face. They had designed the program to offer second chances, but what if some people didn't want a second chance? Or what if their addiction, trauma, or mental health issues were so deep that they didn't even believe they could get better? "We've always known there would be outliers," John said slowly. "People who are harder to help. But we've made so much progress. This is a setback, but it's not the end. We can't afford to give up on these people." Elon nodded, his expression softening. "I'm not saying we give up on them. I'm saying we need to rework the system. We need to rethink how we're addressing their needs. Maybe it's time we expand beyond just job training and housing. Maybe it's time we focus more on long-term mental health and addiction recovery, even if it means going deeper into these issues than we've been willing to." John's eyes widened. He had been hesitant to lean too heavily into mental health and addiction recovery before, fearing it would overcomplicate the program. But Elon's point was clear. If they were truly going to make a lasting difference, they couldn't just treat the symptoms. They had to address the root causes. "Do you have a plan?" John asked. "I think we need a more integrated model," Elon replied. "A two-pronged approach. One track for people who are ready and able to engage with job training and housing programs, and another for people who need intensive therapy, mental health care, and addiction treatment. It's not enough to just give them a job. They need to be equipped to handle the underlying issues that caused them to be homeless in the first place." John let the idea sink in. It was a massive shift, an expansion of their mission in a way that would require more resources, more expertise, and more patience. But it made sense. If they truly wanted to end homelessness, they needed to provide more than just shelter. They needed to provide a full, holistic approach to healing. Later that day, John gathered the team to discuss the new direction. As they sat around the large conference table, John presented the idea to everyone. Some of the staff members were excited by the change, while others were apprehensive. It was one thing to offer job training and temporary housing. It was another to offer long-term rehabilitation, mental health care, and addiction counseling. But despite the reservations, there was an underlying understanding that this was the next step. If they were going to succeed, they had to be willing to take on the tougher challenges. One of the team members, Lisa, a social worker who had been with the program since the beginning, raised her hand. "This is a good direction, but we're going to need more resources to make this work. More staff, more therapists, more funding. We're already stretched thin." John nodded. "I know, but this is what we're here for. We're not just solving a temporary problem. We're helping people rebuild their lives. And rebuilding a life takes time." It's not just about getting them a job or a house. It's about making sure they're ready to hold on to that job and keep that house. The next few months were a blur of preparation. They recruited mental health professionals, addiction counselors, and long-term support staff. They revamped their tech platform to accommodate the new programs, and they secured additional funding to expand their services. Elon's team worked tirelessly to integrate AI-driven therapy models into their platforms, allowing for more personalized care for individuals in need of intensive rehabilitation. As the program began to roll out its expanded model, John felt both excited and nervous. It was a bold move, and there was no guarantee that it would work. But if they could make it succeed, it would be a game-changer. Then, just as things were starting to come together, an unexpected challenge arose. A major political figure, Senator James Walker, publicly criticized the program during a national town hall. The senator claimed that the initiative was misallocating public funds, arguing that it was a waste of taxpayer money to focus on mental health and addiction recovery for the homeless. "We can't keep throwing money at people who refuse to help themselves," the senator said. "We need to stop enabling them. We need to enforce stricter policies to remove the homeless from public spaces." John watched the broadcast with a sinking feeling in his stomach. This was the kind of rhetoric that had dominated the debate around homelessness for years. People viewed the homeless as a drain on society, rather than as individuals who had fallen through the cracks of a broken system. In the days that followed, the media latched onto the senator's comments, and the pressure on John and the program mounted. Critics who had previously been quiet now found their voices. Op-eds were written. Radio hosts debated. It seemed like the entire country was talking about the program, but not always in a positive light. But for every critic, there were voices of support as well. Volunteers, former participants in the program, and even some of the city officials who had helped launch the initiative came to their defense. "We can't just sweep this problem under the rug," one of the program's former participants said in an interview. "The people I've met through this program, they're not lazy or useless. They're people who had a bad break, who got lost along the way. This program gave me a second chance, and now I have a job, a home, and my life back. If you don't believe in that, you don't understand what it means to be human." It was a tough battle, but it was also a necessary one. In the end, John knew that change never came easily. They had to face the critics head-on and continue to prove that their approach wasn't just about giving people handouts. It was about giving people hope and the tools to rebuild their lives. As the controversy began to settle, John couldn't help but think back to the moment when Elon had asked him to dinner. Everything had changed since then. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. They weren't going to back down. They were going to fight for those who had been forgotten. As the months rolled on, the debate surrounding the program's expansion began to wane, but the internal struggles and growing pains persisted. While the media attention had begun to subside, the pressure on John and the team was mounting. They had managed to gain significant political and financial support, but as the program expanded into new cities and incorporated mental health and addiction recovery, the logistics became far more complicated. In Chicago, the second largest city in their rollout, the situation was particularly tense. The local political climate had soured, with certain influential factions skeptical of the program's new direction. In response to the senator's comments, some officials had questioned whether their tax dollars should be directed at rehabilitating the unrehabilitable, as one local pundit put it. For John, the past few weeks had been a whirlwind of meetings, press conferences, and crisis management. The logistical challenges of the new approach were vast, and the emotional toll of having their motives questioned made it harder to stay positive. In a private meeting with his team, John leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We need to keep pushing through," he said, his voice hoarse. "We know this is right. We know we're doing good work. The question is, how do we get others to see that?" Elon, who had flown in from California for the meeting, sat across from John, his usual energetic presence tempered by the somber tone of the conversation. "This is just a phase," Elon said, his eyes scanning the room. "There will always be pushback when you try to change the status quo. People don't like change. But the numbers are starting to speak for themselves. Once we have real data showing that the new model works, we can shift the narrative." John nodded, but he couldn't shake the unease in his gut. But what if the data isn't enough? What if the political opposition is too entrenched? Elon smiled, leaning forward. You've been fighting this fight longer than I have, John. I know how hard it is. But this isn't about politics. This is about people's lives. And at the end of the day, people will rally behind what's right, especially when they see the impact it has on real people. Our work isn't over. It's just getting started. It was a difficult time for the team, but despite the pressure, John found himself reinvigorated by the resilience of the people they were helping. One story in particular stuck with him. A young woman named Jessica, who had been living on the streets of Chicago for nearly 4 years. She had struggled with severe addiction and mental health issues, but when she entered the program, there was a spark of hope. At first, Jessica had been wary. She was hesitant to trust anyone, let alone a program promising to help her get her life back. But over time, with the support of a dedicated caseworker and therapists, she began to open up. Jessica was placed in one of their long-term recovery centers, where she received intensive therapy for her addiction and trauma. When John met Jessica for the first time, she had been sober for nearly 6 months. Her eyes were clearer, and there was a new energy in her voice when she spoke about her future. "I never thought I'd get here," she said, her hands shaking slightly as she held her coffee cup. "I didn't think I was worth saving, but now I'm starting to believe that I can have a life." That conversation hit John hard. It was easy to get caught up in the politics and the skepticism, but Jessica's transformation was proof that the program had the potential to change lives, if they were willing to push through the difficult moments. The team had always known that homelessness wasn't just about a lack of shelter. It was about the broken systems that kept people stuck in cycles of poverty, addiction, and mental illness. But as the program expanded into new cities, it became increasingly clear just how deeply ingrained those systems were. In New York, for example, they had encountered severe pushback from local shelter organizations. Some groups worried that the program's emphasis on long-term rehabilitation would divert attention and resources away from emergency shelters. Others argued that the focus on mental health and addiction recovery was too ambitious, too expensive. "It's going to take years, John," said Lisa, one of the social workers who had been with the program since the beginning. "You're asking people who've been entrenched in this system for decades to change everything overnight. And there's no magic solution." John understood the concern. The need was so massive, the stakes so high, that it was easy to feel overwhelmed. But there was something inside him that kept him going. Every time he saw a new success story, every time he witnessed someone like Jessica regain control of their life, he knew they were on the right path. "I don't expect overnight results," John replied, his voice steady. "I know this is going to take time, but I also know that we can't afford to wait any longer. We can't keep doing things the way we always have. We need to change the system, and that's going to take work, grit, and yes, time. But we can do it. We've seen it work." In the meantime, the political climate around homelessness was evolving. Some of the fiercest critics of the program, including Senator Walker, had begun to shift their positions. As the data continued to roll in, showing that the long-term recovery approach was indeed improving outcomes, even some of the senator's allies started to take notice. Senator Walker made a public statement calling for a broader national conversation about homelessness, acknowledging that a multifaceted approach, like the one John's program was championing, might be the key to truly solving the crisis. Though he didn't entirely endorse the program, his comments marked a shift in the national dialogue. The door for collaboration was slowly opening, but John wasn't ready to let his guard down. "We've made progress, yes, but we need to keep pushing. We can't afford to get complacent now," he said in a meeting with his team. "We need to show the world that what we're doing is the future, that it works. We need to fight for these people." John's words were beginning to resonate with the broader public. As the media attention shifted back toward the positive results the program was achieving, more cities began to take note. Philadelphia, Boston, and even Miami were reaching out, eager to implement the program in their communities. But as John sat in another meeting, surrounded by his growing team, he felt the weight of their mission more than ever. They had come so far, but there was still so much more to be done. The path ahead was clear, but it wasn't going to be easy. "We're not just building a program," John said, his voice low but steady. "We're building a new way of thinking about homelessness, a way that recognizes the value of every person, no matter where they start. And if we're going to do that, we have to be as resilient as the people we're trying to help. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how much opposition we face, we can't give up. Elon nodded, his gaze unwavering. You're right, and I'm with you all the way. It was a turning point for John. The world was watching. But more importantly, the people they were helping, like Jessica and countless others, were depending on them. There was no turning back. John stood before the large window of the conference room, looking out at the city skyline. The lights of Chicago twinkled in the distance, but his mind was far away. It had been a whirlwind of progress and setbacks, highs and lows, since the program had first launched. But now, after months of fighting through political opposition and logistical nightmares, it felt like they were finally gaining some traction. Despite the challenges, the data was beginning to tell a different story. The long-term recovery model, which combined housing with addiction therapy and mental health support, was showing positive results. But they weren't there yet, not by a long shot. The program needed more funding, more staff, and more time to fully integrate into the communities that needed it the most. He was interrupted by a knock at the door. Lisa, his lead social worker, stepped in, her face drawn but determined. "We have a situation," she said, her tone serious. John turned from the window, a knot forming in his stomach. "What happened?" "It's Jessica," Lisa replied. "She relapsed." John's heart sank. He knew the journey to recovery wasn't linear, but hearing the words still felt like a punch to the gut. Jessica had been one of the program's success stories, someone who had shown immense progress. She'd been sober for nearly 6 months, had reconnected with her family, and was even looking for work. But addiction was a relentless enemy, and sometimes, no matter how hard someone tried, they slipped. "How is she?" John asked, trying to mask his concern with a calm, professional tone. "She's in a bad place," Lisa said. "She's back on the streets. She's refusing help, and she's isolating herself from everyone. The relapse triggered something deeper, something we haven't fully addressed yet. Her trauma. It's bigger than the addiction." John closed his eyes, feeling the weight of it all. There was no easy fix for situations like this. They could offer the resources, the shelter, the therapy, but they couldn't force people to heal. The path to recovery was unpredictable. It wasn't just about offering shelter and food. It was about digging into the layers of pain, neglect, and loss that had built up over years, decades, in some cases. And even with all the resources in the world, sometimes people just couldn't break free. "We need to go after her," John said, his voice suddenly hardening with determination. "We need to find her, get her the help she needs. Now." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and urgent conversations. Lisa, John, and the team mobilized quickly. They reached out to the outreach workers who had been with Jessica during her recovery process. They spoke to the local shelters, social workers, and even some of Jessica's family members who had been in touch with her recently. But no one had heard from her in days. "John, this is going to take time," Elon said, as he joined the meeting via video call. He had been in California working on the next phase of their tech rollout, but when he heard about Jessica, he immediately made time to talk. "We can't rush recovery. We have to give Jessica space, even if it's hard to watch her spiral." "I know," John replied, clenching his fists. "But we've invested so much into her recovery, into all of them. I won't stand by and watch her slip through the cracks. We need to keep fighting." Elon nodded, his expression sympathetic but calm. "You're right. But remember, this is a long-term battle. Sometimes, we just have to be patient and keep showing up for them." That night, John took to the streets himself. He had never been one to shy away from getting his hands dirty, and if anyone was going to find Jessica, he felt it had to be him. Walking through the familiar streets of Chicago, passing by the makeshift shelters, the people huddled in corners, John's heart weighed heavy. He had seen this too many times before. Faces that had become lost in the cracks of society, people who had given up on themselves because no one had ever given them the chance to fight back. After hours of searching, he finally found her. Jessica was sitting in a dark alley, her face obscured by her unkempt hair. She was huddled over a bottle, trying to drown out the world around her. When John approached, she didn't look up at first. He knelt beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Jessica," he said softly, "it's John. We're here to help." At first, she didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the ground. But when she finally looked up at him, the pain in her eyes was undeniable. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale, and there was a dullness in her gaze that broke John's heart. "I'm not ready, John," she whispered. "I don't think I can do it. I can't go back to the program. I can't." John sat down beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to do it alone, Jessica. You don't have to be ready today. You just have to be willing to try. We've got you. You're not alone in this." Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes, and for a moment, John saw a flicker of the woman she had been before. Strong, hopeful, determined. But it was fleeting, and she quickly looked away. "I'm tired," she murmured. "So tired of fighting." John's heart ached. He understood more than she knew. He knew the exhaustion of fighting every single day, of being told to keep going when it felt impossible. He knew the pain of failure and the hopelessness that came with it. But he also knew that the hardest battles were often the ones worth fighting the most. "You don't have to do it all right now," John said. "One step at a time. We can take it slow. You're stronger than you think, Jessica. I know that. We all know that." After a long silence, Jessica nodded slowly. "I'll try, but I'm scared." John reached out and gently placed his hand on hers. "We're all scared sometimes, but you don't have to be alone in this. We'll be here every step of the way." The following days were filled with phone calls, interventions, and deep conversations with Jessica. She agreed to return to the program, but this time with more intensive support. They had learned from her previous experience that she needed not just the shelter and the job training, but long-term therapy that addressed her trauma directly. She needed a slower, more personal approach. For John, Jessica's return felt like a small victory in the larger war they were fighting. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was a step forward. And sometimes that was all they could ask for. As the days turned into weeks, the program continued to evolve. The data was more promising than ever, and the partnerships with local governments grew stronger. Cities across the country were beginning to implement the new model of care that John and his team had pioneered. Homelessness was still a daunting problem, but for the first time in years, there was a sense of hope that it could be solved. But the fight was far from over. There would be more challenges, more setbacks, and more people like Jessica who needed saving. And as much as John wanted to believe they had turned a corner, he knew that this was just one battle in a much longer war. Still, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of optimism. Change was hard. Progress was slow, but it was happening. And as long as they kept fighting for people like Jessica, John knew that one day, they would see a world where homelessness was a thing of the past. The weeks that followed Jessica's return to the program felt like a steady climb, a slow but essential process. John watched with a mix of hope and apprehension as she began to engage in therapy more actively, started attending group sessions, and reconnected with the support system that had been built for her. Though it wasn't an easy road, and there were setbacks, there was undeniable progress. Her initial resistance had turned into cautious optimism, and for the first time in a while, John allowed himself to believe that she might actually make it. But as Jessica's journey began to find some stability, another challenge emerged: funding. Despite the increasing success of the program, the financial constraints were becoming more severe. The sheer scale of the expansion was overwhelming, and they had yet to secure the long-term, sustainable funding they needed to ensure the program's future. Though the politicians and local governments were starting to come around, they still weren't ready to make the kind of investments necessary to support long-term change. And without funding, they couldn't grow. Without growth, the people who needed help the most would continue to fall through the cracks. It was a sinking feeling John had been trying to ignore for months. The weight of constantly chasing funds, securing grants, and meeting with donors. The work was essential, but it wasn't the work he wanted to be focused on. It was draining him, both physically and emotionally. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," John admitted one evening to Lisa. After a long day of meetings with government officials and potential donors, they were sitting in his office, the flickering light of the city below casting long shadows against the walls. "You're doing what needs to be done, John," Lisa said softly. her voice a blend of understanding and concern. But we can't keep running on empty. You need to find a way to recharge. John leaned back in his chair, staring out at the skyline, trying to shake the fatigue that had settled deep in his bones. He thought about everything they had accomplished, the lives they had touched, the people they had helped, but it all felt fragile. So many pieces had fallen into place, but one financial misstep or a shift in public opinion could bring it all crashing down. I know I need a break, John said, though the words felt hollow. But I can't stop now. Not when we're so close. It wasn't long before that moment came. A turning point that John hadn't expected, one that would shape the direction of the program in ways no one could have anticipated. It happened at one of their fundraising galas, an event that had been organized to bring in new donors. John had been dreading the night, knowing that he would have to stand in front of a room full of strangers and convince them to invest in a vision that was still in its early stages. The pressure of trying to sell the program's future while still grappling with its present challenges felt like an impossible task. But as he stood before the crowd, preparing his speech, something unexpected occurred. One of the attendees, a man dressed in a tailored suit, his hair carefully styled, stood up and interrupted him mid-sentence. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the man said, his voice smooth but firm. "But I think you're going about this all wrong." John blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" The man stepped forward, his gaze fixed on John. "You're asking for money, yes. But you're asking for it based on fear. You're asking people to give because homelessness is a problem. But what you need to do is show them what's possible. Show them the hope that can come from this. The change that can happen when we work together." John felt a knot form in his stomach. Who was this guy? The man smiled slightly, as if he knew what John was thinking. "I'm not here to lecture you, John. But you've got a great thing going. You've got the potential to change lives. What you're doing is revolutionary. But right now, you're framing it wrong. You're framing it like it's a problem to be solved. When, in reality, what you're doing is creating an opportunity for change, for progress, for growth." John paused, unsure of how to respond. This was not the approach he had been taught, nor was it what he'd been planning on saying. But the man's words struck a chord. "I understand your point," John said slowly, gathering his thoughts. "But this isn't just about opportunity. It's about survival. It's about giving people a chance when they have no other options." The man nodded, acknowledging the truth in John's words. "True. But you're also giving them the tools to thrive, not just survive. And that's something people will want to invest in. You need to sell them the dream of what could be. The transformation." The conversation was brief but profound. As the gala continued and the night wore on, John found himself reflecting on the man's words. By the time he returned home that night, he was no longer weighed down by the burden of needing to convince people about homelessness. Instead, he was excited, energized by the vision of what was possible, not just for those struggling on the streets, but for the community at large. If they could show people the transformative power of this program, if they could highlight the hope and future it offered, then the funding would come. He didn't need to keep framing this as a desperate plea. He needed to show the world the impact it could have on everyone, not just the homeless. They weren't just saving lives. They were reshaping the future. The next few weeks were filled with renewed focus and energy. John and his team began to reframe their narrative, highlighting the success stories, like Jessica's, showing how the program wasn't just addressing the immediate need for shelter, but how it was building long-term stability. They began reaching out to potential donors with a fresh pitch. This wasn't just about fixing a problem. This was about creating a future where everyone could have a chance to thrive. And it worked. One of the largest corporate donors, who had been on the fence for months, came through with a substantial contribution. They also secured a partnership with several influential foundations that had been watching the program's progress closely. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to fall into place. But the real breakthrough came when Elon Musk, whose own philanthropic interest had aligned with the program's mission, stepped in with a game-changing donation. One that ensured the program's growth and long-term sustainability. Elon had been quiet for a while, working on his own projects, but when he saw the new direction John and the team had taken, he jumped in with both feet. "You were right," Elon told John over the phone one evening. "This is more than just a charity. This is an investment in the future. and it's worth every cent. The additional funding not only ensured that the program could continue growing, but also allowed John and his team to expand their services even further. They could now offer more tailored recovery programs, provide more comprehensive mental health support, and build new housing in areas that had previously been underserved. The ripple effect of that one conversation, that one shift in perspective, would alter the trajectory of the program forever. What began as a fight for survival had now transformed into a vision for the future. And John, for the first time in months, allowed himself to believe that they could change the world. As he looked back on everything they had accomplished, Jessica's recovery, the expansion of the program, the partnerships they had formed, he knew they were just getting started. The work was far from over, but the possibilities were endless. The phone call came late at night, long after John had left his office for the day. The soft buzz of his phone against the nightstand pulled him from a restless sleep. He groggily picked it up, still half-dazed. But when he saw the caller ID, his heart skipped a beat. It was Lisa. "John, it's Jessica. You need to get here," Lisa's voice crackled through the phone. "She's gone." John bolted upright, adrenaline shooting through his veins. "What happened? Where is she?" There was a long pause before Lisa answered, her voice trembling. "She's gone, John. Jessica." She took off. "We don't know where she is, but she left a note. It was addressed to you." His stomach dropped. He had seen her progress. He had watched her take baby steps back into the program, the group sessions, and therapy. But this felt like a setback too big to recover from. "I'm on my way," he said, hanging up quickly and grabbing his jacket. The icy night air of Chicago hit him as he stepped outside, but nothing felt colder than the hollow fear that churned in his gut. When John arrived at the facility, Lisa was waiting outside the entrance. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She didn't speak as she led him into the small office where Jessica had been staying. The note was there on the desk, an unremarkable piece of paper that looked like it could have been written on a whim, yet the weight of it felt immense. John picked it up, his fingers trembling as he read the words. "John, I don't know if I can keep going. I thought I was stronger than this, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm broken. I'm sorry I let you down. I just need to find my own way. Please don't try to find me. Jessica." The simplicity of the note was like a punch to the gut. She had been doing so well. How had it all unraveled so quickly? Lisa broke the silence. "We've tried everything, John." She was making progress, but the trauma, the pain, it was too much. I think she just couldn't take it anymore. John's throat tightened, his mind racing through every conversation, every small victory they had celebrated. They had known that recovery wasn't a straight line, but this felt like a complete rupture. "Where do we start looking for her?" John asked, his voice raw with emotion. Lisa looked down, defeated. "We don't know, John. She could be anywhere." John spent the next 48 hours scouring the city, visiting shelters, checking alleyways, calling old contacts. Every lead turned up nothing, and with each hour that passed, the sense of hopelessness crept deeper into his heart. The person who had once been a shining example of what could be accomplished was now lost again, and John couldn't shake the guilt that weighed heavily on his shoulders. Elon had been following the situation from afar, offering support as best he could, but there was little he could do in this situation. It wasn't a problem that technology or innovation could fix, not yet, anyway. "Sometimes, you just can't save everyone, John," Elon told him over the phone one evening, his voice filled with rare empathy. "You know that, but you've done everything you can, and sometimes, all we can do is be there when they're ready to come back." John didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to accept that Jessica might never return. To him, it felt like a failure, not just for Jessica, but for the entire program, for everything they had fought for. But the next day, something unexpected happened. John was walking back to his car when his phone buzzed with an incoming text. He didn't recognize the number, but the message was clear. "I'm okay. I just needed some time. Please don't give up on me. I'll come back when I'm ready." John's heart lurched in his chest. For the first time in days, he felt the weight in his chest lift, slightly, but enough to give him hope. He texted back immediately. "We'll be here, whenever you're ready, Jessica. Take the time you need." Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Jessica began to reach out again. She wasn't ready to return to the program, but she checked in with Lisa regularly. She started going to therapy on her own, without the structure of the program. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. She was taking her own path, in her own time, and that was something. John wasn't sure what the future held for Jessica, but he had learned something important in these past weeks. The journey of recovery wasn't just about providing shelter or therapy. It was about meeting people where they were, at their own pace. It wasn't about pushing them to a certain destination. It was about walking beside them, even when they took a detour. As Jessica's recovery took its uncertain course, John turned his focus back to the program. The new funding from Elon and other donors had begun to roll in, giving them the opportunity to expand their reach. They opened new centers, hired more staff, and created partnerships with mental health professionals who could help tackle the deeper, more complex issues of trauma that so many of their clients faced. It wasn't the clean, linear progress they had hoped for, but it was progress. And John was learning to accept that. He knew that change, real change, took time. He had seen it with Jessica. He had seen it with others who had come through the program. It wasn't just about the immediate needs. It was about the long road to healing, which was often jagged and unpredictable. One crisp autumn afternoon, several months later, John was sitting in the new community center, discussing the next phase of the program's growth. He was tired but optimistic. He had learned that the road was always longer than expected, the setbacks more painful than imagined, but the moments of progress, those tiny, hard-earned victories, made it all worth it. As he sat there with Lisa, discussing the details of an upcoming expansion, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Jessica. "I'm ready to come back. I need help, John. I'm ready to try again." He looked up at Lisa, his eyes filled with emotion. "She's coming back." Lisa smiled warmly, her eyes reflecting a sense of relief and pride. "You never gave up on her. And now she's ready to come back?" The journey was far from over. There would be more people like Jessica, lost, struggling, and searching for a way out. There would be more setbacks, more moments of doubt, and more challenges along the way. But John was no longer afraid of the uncertainty. He understood now that recovery wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience. And in that resilience, there was always hope. And as he looked at the message from Jessica one more time, he knew, no matter how long it took, no matter how hard it got, they were all in this together. The days following Jessica's decision to return were filled with hope and trepidation. John had learned through the months of working with people in the program that recovery was rarely a smooth road. It was messy. It was hard. But it was always possible if the person was willing to take those first steps, and Jessica was taking hers. She began attending therapy again, though it was clear she wasn't ready to rejoin the program full-time. For now, it was just small steps, but John was proud of how far she had come. Jessica's return had a ripple effect on the entire team. There was a renewed sense of purpose within the program, and it wasn't just because of the new funding or the expansion. It was because Jessica had been a symbol of what they were working toward, a living proof that transformation was possible, even if it came with fits and starts. But John knew the real challenge wasn't just getting people off the streets. It was helping them rebuild their sense of identity and worth, especially when they had spent so long feeling invisible. And it wasn't just the residents who needed that healing. It was the entire community. That's when the idea came to him. One late afternoon, as John and Lisa sat in the newly renovated community center, a space that was once a run-down building now brimming with light and energy, John shared his idea. What if we create a space where people, both in the program and in the community, can come together? A space where people aren't just getting help, but also giving it. John asked, his eyes alight with excitement. Lisa looked at him, intrigued but cautious. "You mean like a community outreach thing?" "Exactly," John said, standing up and pacing the room. "We're always talking about how homelessness isn't just an issue for the homeless, but an issue for the community. If we could create a program where everyone, residents, local business owners, even those who aren't directly involved in the program, could work together, maybe we could create something bigger than just services. We could build something that doesn't just change lives, it transforms communities." Lisa thought for a moment, then smiled. "I think you're onto something. It's not just about fixing the broken. It's about showing people how they can contribute, how they can be part of the solution. That's what changes the narrative. John's heart raced with excitement. It was a big idea, but it felt right. Exactly. What if we started a volunteer program where those who've gone through the program could mentor new participants? What if we could have businesses sponsor local initiatives, offer jobs, and even train others? We could create a network of mutual support where people can learn to lift each other up instead of just being given handouts. Lisa nodded, catching his enthusiasm. And we could make it sustainable by reinvesting the profits back into the program. People need to see that giving back isn't just a one-time thing. It's a cycle. The plan began to take shape quickly. They would create a community circle program where residents, volunteers, and local businesses could collaborate to create projects that directly benefited the city. Everything from beautifying neighborhoods to hosting workshops that taught skills like resume building, financial literacy, and job interview preparation. They began by reaching out to a few local businesses, explaining their vision and how it could positively impact the city. At first, the response was tepid. Many business owners weren't sure how they could fit into this kind of program. But John and Lisa were persistent. They organized small meetings, shared stories of the individuals who had found success within the program, and gradually, they began to see the wheels turn. One by one, businesses started to get involved. A local cafe offered free coffee for volunteers. A construction company agreed to sponsor a home renovation project for a family coming out of the program. A tech startup committed to providing mentorship and job training. It wasn't just about charity. It was about collaboration, a shared belief that when everyone worked together, everyone benefited. By the time they launched the first community event, a neighborhood cleanup with participants from the program, local business owners, and volunteers, there was a palpable sense of excitement. What started as a simple idea had grown into a movement. And what John hadn't expected was how quickly people who had once felt powerless, people who had once been overlooked, started taking ownership of the program's success. Jessica, who had been hesitant at first, now found herself leading one of the cleanup teams. She wasn't fully back in the program, but she was making progress. It was small, but it was there. Her confidence grew as she worked alongside others who had been in similar situations, and for the first time, she saw herself not as someone who needed help, but as someone who had something valuable to offer. Weeks later, they launched their first job training program in partnership with several local companies. People in the program began to get real-world experience, learn new skills, and in some cases, even secure part-time work. For the first time, John began to see a true shift in the way people viewed homelessness, not as a permanent condition, but as a temporary state that could be changed with the right resources, support, and most importantly, community. The center, which had once been a small, almost forgotten space, now buzzed with activity every day. There was a sense of collective pride, as if everyone, residents and volunteers alike, had a stake in what was happening. And as John walked through the center, watching people engage in the program, he realized that they weren't just rebuilding lives. They were rebuilding their city, one small act of kindness at a time. One afternoon, as the program was nearing full capacity and the community center had become a hub of energy and hope, Elon Musk paid a surprise visit. He had heard about the program's success and wanted to see it for himself. John, who had always admired Elon's work but never thought he'd meet him face to face, was both excited and nervous as they sat down in the center's small meeting room. Elon was, as always, sharp and focused, but there was a warmth in his eyes that John hadn't expected. "I've been watching you, John," Elon said after a few minutes of small talk, "and I think what you're doing here is remarkable. You've taken a problem and flipped it on its head. You're not just solving homelessness, you're creating opportunities for people to become contributors to society. And that's something I want to be a part of." John tried to keep his composure, but the compliment felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest. "We're still a long way from solving everything, but we're starting to see real change. And that's all I've ever wanted, to make a difference." "I can see that. And I'm in," Elon said, his words simple but powerful. "I'll personally fund the expansion of your programs. I believe in what you're doing. You've got the right idea, community empowerment. Keep going, and I'll make sure you have the resources you need." Elon's investment marked a pivotal moment in the program's growth. With his support, They were able to open more centers, expand their reach, and provide even more services. The program's success spread like wildfire, attracting attention from other major donors and government bodies. But what made it truly different was the community-driven model they had created, one that emphasized collaboration, mutual support, and empowerment. As John sat in his office that evening, reflecting on how far they had come, he couldn't help but smile. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it was also filled with hope. They weren't just changing lives, they were changing how people thought about the world and their place in it. And as for Jessica, she had found her place in the community, no longer a victim of her circumstances, but an active participant in something much bigger than herself. For the first time in a long time, she believed in her future. The last few months had been nothing short of a whirlwind. John had seen the community come together in ways he never thought possible. The center, once a place of quiet desperation, was now alive with energy, laughter, shared stories, and the sound of hands working together to rebuild not just homes but lives. The program was thriving. More people had entered than ever before, some staying, some leaving to build new lives, and some returning when they felt ready. John stood on the rooftop of the new community center one bright morning, looking out over the city. The skyline stretched before him. Tall buildings that once seemed like monuments to success were now reminders of how much work was left to do. But for the first time in years, John could see beyond the hurdles. He saw the bigger picture. He could see the lives that had been transformed, the people who had found a sense of purpose and hope, and the community that had rallied behind them. He had worked tirelessly, fought for funding, battled skepticism, and faced his own moments of doubt. But now, he realized, they had built something sustainable. Not just a shelter, not just a program, but a movement that was redefining what it meant to help the homeless. Jessica had come a long way since that pivotal moment when she sent her message to John, letting him know she was ready to come back. Her recovery was still a journey, one that took time and patience, but she was starting to trust herself again. She had a job now, working part-time at the local cafe, and she had even started a small support group within the program, helping others who were struggling with their own demons. It was incredible to see how much she had grown, how much strength she had found in the process of helping others. One afternoon, as John walked through the center, he saw Jessica sitting with a few newcomers, listening to their stories and offering advice. Her presence was calming, grounded, and reassuring. She was a living example of the transformation the program sought to instill. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a leader. "John," she called out as she saw him pass by. "Can I talk to you for a second?" He stopped, smiling at her. "Of course. What's up?" Jessica stood up and walked over to him. There was something different about her now, a sense of purpose in the way she held herself. She wasn't the fragile person who had walked through the door months ago. She was someone who had weathered the storm and was standing tall. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but thoughtful. "I know I'm still working on myself, but I want to do more for this community. I've been talking to Lisa and a few others, and we've come up with an idea. What if we created a program specifically for those coming out of the system, people who've been incarcerated or are trying to get back on their feet after addiction? A place where they can get the same kind of support we've gotten here." John felt a surge of pride and hope. Jessica had gone from someone unsure of herself to someone with a vision, someone who was using her experiences to build something meaningful. "That's an amazing idea," he said, his voice full of admiration. "You're right. There's such a gap in services for people coming out of incarceration or recovery. We could offer them housing, job training, therapy, all the things that helped you. But it has to come from people like you, who understand what it's like." Jessica's eyes lit up. "I want to help others the way I was helped, and I think we could make a real impact. I'm ready to take this on." John clapped her on the back. "You're already doing it, Jessica, and this idea is exactly what we need. Let's make it happen." The idea of creating a program for people coming out of incarceration and addiction recovery quickly gained traction. John and Lisa rallied the staff, volunteers, and even local businesses to get involved. They started small, initially offering transitional housing, job placement services, and a community support group for those making the tough shift back into society. But it quickly became clear that the need was greater than they had anticipated. They began to partner with more organizations, legal aid groups, mental health professionals, and addiction counselors. Elon Musk, who had continued to support the center, helped secure additional funding for the new initiative. His belief in the program's ability to create long-lasting change only grew as he saw firsthand how lives were being turned around. One cold winter evening, as John sat in his office working on a new proposal, he received a call from Elon. He picked up, curious about what the tech mogul had to say this time. "John, I've been thinking," Elon's voice came through, his tone uncharacteristically serious. "You've done something incredible with this program, and I think it's time to take it to the next level. I want to help scale it, not just in Chicago, but nationwide." John's heart skipped a beat. "What are you thinking?" "I'm talking about creating a national network of these community-based programs. A real blueprint for how cities across the country can tackle homelessness, recidivism, and addiction recovery. We'll bring together organizations that are already doing good work, but we'll add the elements that make your program unique: community involvement, empowerment, and real-world solutions. It's going to take time, but I believe we can change the narrative on homelessness." John was silent for a moment, processing what Elon was saying. "Are you sure? This is huge. It's not just about opening more centers. It's about creating a culture shift. It's about challenging the way people think about these issues." "I know," Elon replied, his voice unwavering, "but you've already shown that it's possible. And if we can do it here, we can do it anywhere. We just need the right people, the right resources, and the right vision. And that's where I think you come in." John sat back in his chair, a sense of disbelief washing over him. This was the opportunity he had always dreamed of, the chance to scale the program, to expand its impact, and to help change the way America thought about homelessness and recovery. But it wasn't just about the scale. It was about the principles. The focus on human dignity, the belief that anyone could transform their life with the right support, and the understanding that communities are stronger when they are inclusive and supportive. "I'm in," John said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do it." The months that followed were a blur of meetings, planning, and coordination. The team worked tirelessly to refine the model, incorporating lessons learned from their time in Chicago. Elon's involvement brought in a new level of attention to the program, attracting media coverage and more donors who believed in the cause. But as the program expanded, John never lost sight of the heart of it all: the people. As the first national pilot centers opened in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta, John traveled from one to the next, witnessing firsthand the transformative power of community support. He met people who had been given a second chance at life, people who were no longer invisible, who had found their way back to work, family, and hope. One evening, after a long day of meetings in New York, John found himself standing in front of a window, looking out at the city lights. The skyline was vast and sprawling, just like the future of the program. He thought of all the lives that had been touched, the people who had once felt hopeless, who had been given a place to start over, to be seen, to be heard. It wasn't just about solving homelessness. It was about breaking down the walls of isolation and creating communities where everyone had the chance to thrive. And as John looked out over the city, he realized that the journey was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Back in Chicago, Jessica walked through the community center one last time before she headed home for the night. She paused at the front door and looked back at the faces she had grown so close to, the people who had shared their pain, their triumphs, their struggles with her. She had been through so much, and now she had the strength to help others find their way. John's words echoed in her mind. "You're already doing it, Jessica." And she smiled, knowing that she was exactly where she needed to be. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?